We turn our attention to Edo, in the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate. It is the 12th year of the Tempo era, corresponding to 1841 in the eastern capital. The cherry blossoms have fallen along the Sumida River, and the first summer fires are being lit in the watchtowers of the daimyo residences. A city of perhaps 1 million souls stretches between the shogun's castle and the flatlands of the east, rivaling London and the largest cities of Europe, yet largely unknown to the world beyond its shores. Edo, the river mouth, lies still beneath a sky the color of wet slate on the 18th morning of the 5th month, and you are standing at the edge of the Sumida where the mist smells of brine and rotting wood. The cold weight of dawn air before the summer heat moves across your face like a hand withdrawn from water, and around you the great city begins its slow emergence from the darkness that has held it since the 9th hour of the previous evening. You hear the first sound now, a wooden clapper striking 3 measured beats from somewhere beyond the curve of the river, and then a voice calling the hour in the empty streets before first light, announcing that all is well in this district, that no fire burns unchecked, that the peace of the Tokugawa shogunate remains undisturbed. This span from 1603 to 1868 represents more than 250 years of rule by a single family whose founder, Tokugawa Ieyasu, once served as vassal to Imagawa Yoshimoto and later allied himself with Oda Nobunaga before he claimed the title of shogun and established his bakufu, his tent government, here at the eastern edge of the Kanto plain. The peace that Ieyasu forged, sometimes called the Pax Tokugawa, has become the longest period of peace in Japanese history, and you feel it now in the stillness of these streets where no soldier marches and no alarm disturbs the river mist. The name Edo literally means river mouth or estuary, and this meaning lies in the water that surrounds you on 3 sides, in the canals that thread through the pleasure districts and the merchant quarters, in the Sumida itself, which carries the tide up from the bay where the fishing boats wait for the turn of the water. You watch as the first fishermen push off from the river with the tide, their wooden hulls barely disturbing the surface, their lanterns swinging in small arcs that cast no reflection, yet upon water still too dark to hold light. The cold weight of dawn air presses against the backs of their necks as they bend to their oars, and their breath shows faintly before them in small clouds that dissolve into the greater mist. Lantern light, reflected in puddles from last night's rain, begins to appear now in the narrow lanes behind you, where the first sober vendors begin boiling water in their stalls, the steam rising white against the darker shapes of their awnings. You turn from the river and walk toward them, your wooden clogs on packed earth making the sound tock-tock-tock that echoes between the plaster walls of the merchant houses, each beat falling into the silence like a pebble into deep water. The distant cry of the first vegetable sellers reaches you from the direction of the Kanda district, where the morning market is assembling its baskets of greens and its barrels of pickled radish, and you follow the sound through streets that narrow and widen without pattern, past gates still closed and windows still shuttered against the chill. A samurai retainer hurries through the Kanda district toward the castle, his 2 swords catching what little light has begun to gather in the east, his stride quick and deliberate though the hour is still early, and the great gates of the Tokugawa stronghold will not open for another 2 bells. You step aside to let him pass, and you notice the crest upon his coat, 3 hollyhock leaves in a circle, the mark of the shogunal house that has governed this city since 1603 and will continue to govern it, though none here know this, until 1868. The retainer does not see you, or sees you only as a shape to be avoided, a commoner in common clothes, and his wooden clogs on packed earth make the sound tock-tock-tock that fades into the distance ahead of you. The castle rises before you now, its foundation of massive stone blocks dark with the moisture of the river mist, its white walls beginning to show their plaster against the slowly lifting sky. You do not approach the inner circles, for your place is not there, but you walk along the outer moat, where the willows hang their branches into water that carries the reflection of a sky still more grey than rose, and you watch as the first smoke rises from 10,000 kitchens as the city awakens. The cold weight of dawn air carries this smoke in layers, the thicker lower strata from wood fires, the thinner higher wisps from charcoal, each marking a different quarter, a different class of household, a different manner of beginning the day. The distant cry of the vegetable sellers grows louder as you turn westward, away from the castle and toward the rising sun that has not yet cleared the low hills beyond the river. You pass a bridge where a night watchman stands with his lantern still lit, though the sky has begun to pale, and he nods to you without speaking, his night of calling the hour nearly ended, his clapper now silent in his belt. Lantern light reflected in puddles from last night's rain catches the last of his flame as he turns away, and you see your own shadow for the first time, stretched long and thin across the packed earth of the road. More sober vendors have begun boiling water in their stalls now, their kettles sending up columns of steam that mingle with the smoke rising from 10,000 kitchens, and the smell of buckwheat blends with the sharper scent of fish broth and the sweetness of miso beginning to dissolve in hot water. You stop at one stall where the vendor, a woman of middle years with her hair drawn back in the style of the working class, offers you a bowl without asking if you will take it, for the custom of this city is to serve first and receive payment after, and the trust of the Edo period lives in this small exchange. The bowl warms your hands, and the steam rises into your face, and the cold weight of dawn air seems for a moment to retreat before the heat of the broth. You eat standing, as others do, your wooden clogs on packed earth making no sound now as you shift your weight, the tock-tock-tock of your earlier walking replaced by the softer sounds of sipping and swallowing, the distant cry of the vegetable sellers still reaching you from the market that grows more crowded with each passing quarter bell. The vendor speaks to you of the weather, of the likelihood of rain before noon, of the price of radishes this week compared to last, and her voice is low and unhurried, the voice of one who has risen before dawn for 30 years and expects to rise before dawn for 30 more, who has known only the peace of the Tokugawa shogunate and cannot imagine another way that the world might be ordered. You finish your soba and return the bowl, and you pay what is asked without bargaining, for this too is the custom of the city, and you walk on as the sky continues its slow brightening from slate to pearl to the faint rose that precedes true gold. The fishermen who pushed off from the Sumida River with the tide are now visible as small shapes against the widening water, the nets spread between them in patterns that repeat and repeat, the same gestures that their grandfathers made and their grandfathers before them, back through the more than 250 years that this period represents, back to the time when Tokugawa Ieyasu first established his bakufu and made this river mouth his capital. The castle looms again as you walk, for the city circles around it as water circles a stone, and you see now the same samurai retainer, his two swords catching the light that has finally begun to strike the upper walls, his pace unchanged though he has been walking for some time. He passes through a gate where guards examine his credentials, where the crest of 3 hollyhock leaves in a circle is displayed upon a banner that moves slightly in the first breath of morning wind. You do not follow him through that gate, but you watch as he disappears into the shadows of the inner walls, and you know that he goes to serve the shogunate that has maintained the longest period of peace in Japanese history since the year 1603. The river mist begins to lift now, rising in ragged sheets that reveal more of the water, more of the far bank where the pleasure districts sleep still behind their closed shutters, where the night world of entertainers and poets and the patrons who buy their time has not yet yielded to the day. You turn away from this, for your path lies elsewhere, and you walk through streets that grow wider as you move from the castle district toward the great bridge that crosses the Sumida at a point where the river bends eastward toward the bay. More soba vendors have set up their stalls here, and the smoke rising from 10,000 kitchens has thickened to a haze that softens every edge, every roofline, every distant peak of the surrounding hills. The cold weight of dawn air holds less authority now, and you feel the first suggestion of warmth upon your shoulders, the first intimation of the summer day that will follow this slow beginning. A cat moves across your path, grey against the grey of the unpaved alley, and pauses to watch you with eyes that catch the lantern light reflected in puddles from last night's rain, then continues without hurry into a space between buildings too narrow for you to follow. The distant cry of the vegetable sellers has become the nearer sound of established commerce, of coins changing hands, of baskets being emptied and refilled, of the market finding its daily rhythm. You reach the bridge as the sun clears the hills, and you stand at its center looking back at the city that has unfolded around you since you stood at the river's edge in the darkness. Edo, the river mouth, the estuary, written as Jido and Yido and Yedo in older Western texts, has become one of the largest cities in the world during this period, and you see now the scale of it, the endless roofs stretching to every horizon, the smoke from 10,000 kitchens becoming indistinguishable from the mist that still clings to the lower ground. The peace of the Tokugawa shogunate holds this moment, as it has held every morning for more than 2 centuries, and you feel it in the unhurried movements of the people who now fill the bridge around you, in the absence of armed men, beyond the samurai retainer who hurried through the Kanda district, in the sound of wooden clogs on packed earth making the tok-tok-tok that continues without urgency in every direction. The last phase from 1853 to 1867, called Bakumatsu, lies still in the future, unknown and unimagined, and the year 1841 belongs to the Pax Tokugawa, a long period of peace in Japanese history, the peace that Tokugawa Ieyasu forged when he established his rule after serving as vassal to Imagawa Yoshimoto and allying himself with Oda Nobunaga. You leave the bridge and walk along the eastern bank, where the great houses of the daimyo stand with their walls of whitewashed plaster and their gates of heavy timber, each displaying the crest of its clan, each maintaining the residence required by the shogunate that keeps the feudal lords close and watchful. The Tokugawa family crest of 3 hollyhock leaves in a circle appears upon the largest of these gates, upon the banners that hang limp in the still air, upon the lanterns that have burned through the night and now pale in the growing daylight. The cold weight of dawn ere lingers in the shadows of these walls, and you walk in sunlight and shadow alternately as the street turns and narrows. The soba vendors have given way now to vendors of other things, of tea and of rice balls, and of the sweetened bean paste that the people of this city favor in the morning hours. You buy nothing more, but you walk among them, and the smoke from 10,000 kitchens mingles with the steam of their kettles and the smoke of their charcoal braziers, and the smell is the smell of Edo, the river mouth, the estuary, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate from 1603 to 1868. The period from 1603 to 1868 represents more than 250 years, and you are walking through one morning of that span, one day among the thousands that have passed and the thousands that will pass before the last shogun yields his authority, and the name Edo itself gives way to Tokyo, the eastern capital. The river mist has lifted entirely from the lower reaches of the Sumida, though it still hangs in pale bands across the wider water toward the bay. You find a place where the bank has been reinforced with stone, where a willow of great age trails its branches into the current, and you sit upon the stone though it is still damp with the night's moisture. The cries of the vegetable sellers have faded into the general sound of the waking city, into the calls of children now released from their houses, into the creak of cart wheels and the lowing of oxen being led toward the slaughtering grounds, into the thousands small sounds that make the morning of a great city. A heron stands in the shallow water below you, motionless as a held breath, its grey form nearly indistinguishable from the grey stone of the bank, and you watch it without moving, your own stillness matching its own. The cold weight of dawn air has become something else now, a memory of chill rather than chill itself, and the warmth that replaces it carries the smell of the day to come, of dust, and of drying mud, and of the sun upon wood and plaster, and the packed earth of a million footsteps. The heron strikes, too fast for your eye to follow, and rises with a small fish silver in its beak and swallows, and resumes its stillness as if nothing has occurred. You rise also, and continue your walking, though the pace of your walking has slowed, and the tock-tock-tock of your wooden clogs on packed earth falls more softly now, more slowly, as the morning advances and the heat builds and the need for haste diminishes. The lantern light, reflected in puddles from last night's rain, has disappeared, dried by sun and air, and the puddles themselves shrink to dark patches upon the ground, to mere discolorations that will be gone by noon. The samurai retainer who hurried through the Kanda district has long since passed through those castle gates, has presented himself to his superiors, has begun the routine of his day in service to the shogunate that will continue to govern until 1868, when the Bakumatsu will have done its work of dissolution. The smoke from 10,000 kitchens has begun to thin, the morning meals prepared and eaten, the fires banked or extinguished, until the noon meal requires their rekindling. You walk through streets that grow more crowded as you approach the commercial heart of the city, where the great merchants have their warehouses and their counting houses, where the money of the realm changes hands in amounts that would astonish the fishermen who pushed off from the Sumida River with the tide, that would seem unreal to the sober vendors boiling water in their stalls. The peace of the Tokugawa shogunate has made this commerce possible, has allowed the accumulation of wealth that supports the vast population of this city, has created the conditions in which Edo grew to become one of the largest cities in the world during this period. The crest of 3 hollyhock leaves in a circle appears upon the awnings of shops that have received the shogunal patronage, upon the packaging of goods that have been presented at court, upon the kimono of officials who move through these streets with the same unhurried authority that you observed in the samurai retainer. The Tokugawa family, whose founder Ieyasu had been a vassal of Imagawa Yoshimoto and an ally of Oda Nobunaga, has permeated every aspect of this city's life, and you see their mark upon the lintels and the banners and the small coins that pass from hand to hand in the morning markets. You turn again toward the river, leaving the densest quarters, seeking the quieter spaces where the morning still lingers though noon approaches. The river mist has entirely dissipated now, and the Sumida flows brown and broad in the full light, its surface broken by the passage of a ferry, by the drifting of a log come loose from some upstream raft, by the sudden plunge of a cormorant that rises empty-beaked and shakes itself upon a mid-river rock. The cold weight of dawn air is only a memory now, a sensation preserved in the shade of certain walls, in the deeper rooms of certain houses, and the day has become itself, warm and bright, and moving toward its own completion. The cries of the vegetable sellers have been replaced by the nearer calls of other sellers, of cooked eel and of chilled barley tea, and of the sweet ices that appear in these streets when the summer heat rises to its height. You do not stop for these, but you hear them, and the sound weaves with the smoke from 10,000 kitchens, with the tock-tock-tock of wooden clogs on packed earth, with the eternal murmur of a million people going about their lives in the longest period of peace in Japanese history. You sit among them, though you are not of them, and they accept your presence as they accept the heron and the cormorant as part of the landscape of their labor. The sun has climbed to its zenith, and the smoke from 10,000 kitchens has become the smoke of 10,000 noon fires, and the morning that began in darkness has completed its first arc toward evening. The peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, also called the Edo period, also called the Tokugawa period, holds you here, holds these fishermen, holds the samurai retainer who now sits in some chamber of the castle performing whatever duties his rank requires. The Bakumatsu waits in the future, and the year 1841 is only itself, a single year in the span from 1603 to 1868 that represents more than 250 years of the longest period of peace in Japanese history, sometimes called the Pax Tokugawa. You close your eyes, and the sound of the river moves through you, and the warmth of the sun upon your face is the warmth of a world that has found, for this long moment, a way to be still. The heron you saw earlier has moved downstream, or else another heron stands where that one stood, and you watch it without the urgency of mourning, without the need to continue walking, to see more, to reach some destination. The wooden clogs on packed earth make the sound tock 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 from somewhere behind you, fading, and the cries of the vegetable sellers, now the cries of the last vegetable sellers, reach you across the water. The smoke from 10,000 kitchens has become the smoke of 10,000 afternoon fires, and the city of Edo, written as Jido and Yido and Yedo in older Western texts, moves through its day with the same unhurried rhythm that carried it through its dawn. You are here in this place, in this moment, and the river flows, and the heron waits, and the peace holds. The morning light comes pale and watery through the paper screens of your room above the lacquer workshop, and you rise from your futon to the sound of your father already stirring below. His name is Jiro, and he has worked with Yorashi for 20 years in this district of Shitamachi, the low-lying eastern districts of Edo where the common people live and labor, and build their lives from wood and paper and patience. You press your feet against the tatami matting, feeling it give slightly underfoot, and the familiar texture reminds you that this is your home, this two-story building where the family sleeps above the craft. Down the ladder you climb, into the workshop where half-finished bowls glow with red Yorashi in the dimness, and the sharp smell of the lacquer mingles with the steam from rice cookers, escaping through bamboo vents in the kitchen beyond. Your father greets you with a gesture toward the polishing stones, and you take your place at the low workbench as the city begins another day of its long existence. The bowls before you have been coated 7 times already, each layer sanded smooth before the next application, and the 8th layer waits in the small ceramic pot beside your elbow. Through the open front of the shop, you watch the street fill with movement. A boy from the neighboring house runs past with 2 wooden buckets clattering against his legs, sent by his mother to fetch water from the communal pump at the corner where the indigo dyers gather. The sharp smell of indigo dye vats drifts across from their workshop 3 doors down, that particular bluestone odor that marks the morning hours before the heat drives the scent upward into the sky. The boy's mother stands in her doorway, watching him go, her hands still wet from the morning washing, and she calls his name once before returning inside to tend the small hearth where millet porridge steams in an iron pot. Your father works in silence at the finer pieces, the cosmetic boxes and incense containers that command higher prices from the merchants who serve the chonin class of townspeople. These chonin have grown wealthy despite their low social status in the formal hierarchy of the realm, and their wealth has changed the nature of commerce in the eastern districts. They do not wear silk in public, as the laws forbid it, but they purchase lacquer of the highest quality for their private chambers, and they pay in copper coinage, the daily currency that passes through 10,000 hands each day in this city of 500,000 souls. The Sumida River defines the eastern edge of the city, and from the upper window where you slept, you could see its grey current moving toward the bay, carrying barges of timber and charcoal and the fresh catch from the fishing villages downstream. Now, at street level, the river is present only in the dampness of the morning air, in the particular quality of light that comes reflected from broad water, in the occasional cry of a gull that has ventured inland to search for scraps among the market stalls. The heron that stood motionless at dawn has flown, and in its place, the human birds of Shitamachi have begun their daily foraging. A brass scale rings from the rice merchant's establishment across the narrow street, the bright metallic sound cutting through the murmur of voices and foot traffic. The merchant weighs out portions for housewives and servants, and the ring of his scale becomes, for you, the measure of the morning's progress, striking again each time another transaction completes. Your father does not look up from his work when the sound comes, but you know he hears it, as he hears everything in this district where he has spent his life, the low-lying eastern districts of Edo, where craftsmen and merchants build their existence from repetition and care. The neighborhood headman passes by your open shop front, his wooden clogs clicking against the packed earth of the street, and he carries a fresh notice from the ward office to post at the community bulletin board near the pump. You will learn later what it contains: the announcement of an upcoming festival at the Asakusa Kannon Temple, which draws pilgrims and entertainers from throughout the city and beyond. The temple sits to the north of this district, its great gate visible on clear days from certain intersections, its courtyard perpetually crowded with the pious and the curious, and those who simply seek the company of others in a sacred space. The festival will mean increased traffic past your shop, increased sales perhaps, and increased vigilance against the danger that haunts every gathering in this city built of wood and paper and dried reed. Fire is a constant danger in the densely packed wooden city, and the memory of conflagration lives in the architecture of Shitamachi. The Great Fire of Mereki in 1657 killed over 100,000 people, a catastrophe that reshaped the consciousness of the city and still echoes in the construction of every building, in the width of certain streets, in the placement of water barrels at regular intervals. After fires, the city was rebuilt quickly with similar dense patterns, for the pressures of population and commerce allowed no other solution, and so the vulnerability remained, inherent in the very form of urban life. Each neighborhood has a voluntary fire brigade with distinctive standards, and you have seen them practice in the open ground near the river, young men in padded jackets carrying long hooks and ladders, the brigade's banner fluttering above them in the practice yard. Your father's workshop, like all the structures in this quarter, carries its own small fire mark on the outer wall, a token of insurance and identification should the worst occur. The mark shows a Paulonia crest, the sign of the mutual association to which he belongs, and beneath it, the date of the building's last reconstruction, barely 10 years past. A fire took the previous structure on a winter night when the dry wind blew from the north, and your family spent 3 months in temporary quarters, while the new building rose with its earthen storehouse walls and its tiled roof, concessions to safety that the old structure had lacked. The Chonin invested in such protections as they could afford, balancing the desire for spacious, light construction against the knowledge of what flame could accomplish in a single hour of wind and panic. The morning advances, and the heat that pressed upon your shoulders in the previous hour has settled into the steady warmth of full day. You work at your bowls, applying the 8th layer of urashi with a brush of human hair set in a bamboo handle, and the red lacquer flows like liquid garnet across the curved surface, self-leveling, patient, demanding nothing but time and a steady hand. Your father inspects a completed piece with a magnifying glass, searching for the minute imperfections that would disqualify it from the premium trade, and his satisfaction shows in the set of his shoulders as he wraps it in soft cloth for delivery. The street outside has grown crowded with the commerce of mid-morning. A palanquin passes, carrying some person of rank who has business in the district, its bearers sweating in their blue jackets as they navigate between the stalls and the standing barrels and the groups of children who pause in their games to watch the procession. The passengers remain invisible behind the bamboo blinds, but their presence is known by the quality of the lacquer on the carriage sides, by the crest embroidered on the hanging curtains, by the very rhythm of the bearers' steps, trained to minimize jostling for those who ride above the common dust. Guilds controlled many trades and required apprenticeships, and your father holds membership in the Lacquer Workers' Association that sets standards and prices and settles disputes between masters. You are not yet formally apprenticed, still in the liminal status of a family member learning the trade by observation. But next year, if your father judges you ready, you will be presented to the guild officers and your formal training will begin. The apprenticeship will last 7 years, during which you will live in your father's house and work in his shop and receive no wages but your keep and your instruction. This is the pattern throughout Shitamachi, where the transmission of skill follows ancient pathways of obligation and loyalty. The boy returns from the pump, his buckets now full and heavy, and water sloshes over the rims to darken the earth of the street. His mother has emerged again to meet him, and she takes the buckets with a word of thanks that reaches you faintly across the distance. The sharp smell of indigo continues to drift from the workshop down the street, where the master dyer and his assistants prepare the day's immersion of cloth, the fabric entering the vat pail and emerging transformed, the color fixed by oxidation in the open air. You have watched this process many times, the rhythmic raising and lowering of the fabric, the gradual deepening of tone as the chemical marriage proceeds, and the skill of it seems to you as demanding as your father's lacquer work, as dependent upon the judgment of eye and hand. The brass scale rings again from across the way, and a woman in an indigo-dyed kimono, the color still slightly uneven from a home application, receives her portion of rice and tucks it into the cloth bag she carries. The copper coinage passes from her hand to the merchants, small rectangular pieces with their square holes for stringing, the daily currency that has replaced the rice economy of earlier centuries for all but the largest exchanges. The sound of the coins is soft, almost inaudible against the ring of the scale and the surrounding voices, but it is the fundamental music of Shitamachi, where commoners and craftsmen and merchants build their mutual prosperity. Your mother descends from the living quarters above, bringing tea in ceramic cups that your father made in his youth before he specialized entirely in lacquer. The cups are simple, unadorned, the glaze slightly uneven where the kiln fire caught them, and she has kept them through all the years of increasing refinement, a reminder of origins. You receive your cup with both hands, as propriety demands, and the warmth spreads through your fingers as you drink. The tea is bitter, the second steeping of leaves already used once this morning, for economy governs even small pleasures in a household where the margin between sufficiency and want remains narrow despite the father's skill. Through the back of the shop, where a narrow passage leads to the small courtyard shared with 3 neighboring houses, you hear the sound of sweeping. 2 apprentices from the dyeing workshop are clearing the street in front of their master's establishment, pushing the night's accumulation of dust and vegetable scraps, and the leavings of passing animals toward the central gutter where the ward sweeper will collect it. Their brooms are of bound bamboo, stiff and effective, and the rhythm of their work carries the particular cadence of young men still half asleep, performing a duty required by their status. They will sweep until the space before the shop is clean, and then they will begin the heavier work of the vats, their hands gradually staining with the indigo that will mark them as dyers for the duration of their apprenticeship and beyond. The notice that the neighborhood headman posted at the pump has drawn a small crowd, and you see heads bent together in consultation, the illiterate listening to those who can decipher the official script. The upcoming festival will mean 3 days of special observance, of street vendors and theatrical performances, and the temporary suspension of certain regulations that govern public behavior. The temple grounds will be crowded to capacity, the approaches lined with stalls selling amulets and refreshments, and the cheap printed images that serve as souvenirs of pilgrimage. For the Chonin, such festivals offer opportunity for display, for the wearing of fine clothing in the guise of religious devotion, for the pleasures of crowds and novelty, and the temporary dissolution of ordinary constraints. Your father finishes his tea and returns to work, and you follow his example, setting aside the empty cup for your mother to collect. The bowls await, and the morning passes in the meditative repetition of application and inspection, the gradual transformation of raw material into object of value. The river has shaped this district as fundamentally as the fire that periodically remakes it, offering transportation and trade and the psychological relief of a boundary, a place where the dense construction finally yields to open sky. The heat of midday arrives, and your mother brings a simple meal of rice and pickled vegetables and a small portion of dried fish. You eat at the workbench, unwilling to lose the productive hours of strongest light, and your father does the same, his eyes still examining the pieces before him even as his hands bring food to his mouth. The shop front remains open, and passers-by glance in, some entering to examine the displayed goods, others continuing on their established courses. A woman of the merchant class pauses to admire a cosmetic box, its surface decorated with the technique of maki, gold powder scattered across the wet lacquer to form a pattern of autumn grasses. She does not purchase, but her admiration registers, and your father notes her interest for future reference, the slow accumulation of customer knowledge that distinguishes the successful craftsman from the merely competent. The afternoon advances in the unhurried rhythm that carried the city through its dawn, and the light that entered pale and watery through the paper screens has become the fuller illumination of the western sky, the sun descending toward the distant hills that bound the city on that side. The sharp smell of indigo has diminished as the day's work in that quarter concludes, replaced by the evening smoke from 10,000 hearth fires drifting across the rooftops, the particular scent of wood and rice straw, and the cheap coal that the common people burn. This smoke, rising as the city prepares for night, carries with it the accumulated warmth of the day's final meal, the steam from rice cookers, escaping through bamboo vents in 10,000 similar structures throughout Shitamachi. The neighborhood headman passes again, this time in the opposite direction, his duties of the morning completed and his evening rest awaiting. He does not carry notices now, but walks with the slower pace of a man whose labor is finished, and he greets your father with the familiarity of long residence in the same quarter. Their exchange concerns the festival arrangements for street cleaning and fire prevention that the ward office has mandated. The Great Fire of Meriki killed over 100,000 people, and no one who lives in this city forgets that fact, no matter how many years have passed. No matter how many times after fires, the city was rebuilt quickly with similar dense patterns. Your father closes the front shutters of the shop as the light begins to fail, the lacquer work impossible to continue without the risk of error that poor illumination invites. He wraps the day's production in cloth and stores it in the fireproof earthen storehouse that occupies the rear corner of the property, and you assist with the sweeping and the final arrangement of tools. The ring of the brass scale comes once more from across the street, the last transaction of the day completing, and then that sound too falls silent as the rice merchant pulls his own shutters closed. The evening entertainment of the district begins to make itself known, the sounds of storytelling and music and drinking houses carrying from the pleasure quarter that lies a short walk to the north. Kabuki theaters and pleasure quarters were located in this district, part of the complex economy of pleasure and performance that serves the chonin, who sought in their hours of leisure the diversions that wealth could purchase. Your father does not frequent such establishments, his temperament and his trade demanding sobriety and steady hands, but you have heard the performances from the street, the declamatory voices of the storytellers, the shamisen plucked strings, the laughter that rises from the upper rooms of the drinking houses where men gather to escape, temporarily, the constraints of their daily existence. Your mother has prepared the evening meal, and the family gathers in the living space above the shop, the same room where you began your day. The tatami gives slightly underfoot as you move to your place, and the low table holds the simple fare of the evening, the rice and miso soup and pickled vegetables that form the staple of your diet. Through the small window, you can see the evening smoke drifting across the rooftops, the city of Edo, written as Jido and Yido and Yedo in older Western texts, settling into its night with the same unhurried rhythm that carried it through its day. The Sumida River is invisible now, lost in the darkness that has risen from the east, but you know it flows still, defining the edge of the city, carrying the barges that will arrive with tomorrow's materials, the timber and the charcoal and the raw yurashi that your father's trade requires. The heron that stood at dawn has found its roost somewhere along the banks, and in its place, the night birds have begun their calling, the owls and the occasional night heron that fishes by moonlight. The fire that is a constant danger in the densely packed wooden city seems, in the darkness, both more immediate and more abstract, the lit hearths visible as points of orange through the paper screens of neighboring houses, each a small defiance of the threat that surrounds them. Your father speaks of the work for tomorrow, the bowls that need their final polishing, the new commission for a set of tea utensils that has come from a merchant in the next ward. The guilds controlled many trades and required apprenticeships, and your father must consult with the association regarding the pricing of this commission, ensuring that he does not undercut the established rates or exceed them in a way that would draw unfavorable attention. The copper coinage has not yet changed hands, but the expectation exists, and the formalities of the trade must be observed before the work can proceed. Your mother clears the table, and you assist her, carrying the dishes to the small washing area where water from the morning's pump still waits in a covered barrel. The boy who fetched water this morning has long since completed his task, and his family too has gathered for their evening meal, their voices audible through the thin walls that separate the structures of this quarter. The sharp smell of indigo has entirely faded, replaced by the more general odor of cooking and wood smoke, and the accumulated humanity of dense settlement. The ladder to the sleeping quarters awaits, and your father climbs first, his day's labor complete, his body demanding the rest that age and exertion require. You follow, feeling the tatami give slightly underfoot as you move across the room, and then the different texture of the wooden ladder rungs beneath your palms. Above, the space is divided by thin screens into the areas of family sleeping, and your place, as the child of the house, remains in the corner nearest the ladder, where the rising heat of the day escapes most slowly through the roof. At closing time, a family climbs the ladder to their sleeping quarters above the store, and this action, repeated throughout Shitamachi, marks the transition from the public day to the private night. The shop below stands empty now, the lacquer tools laid in their places, the half-finished bowls glowing dimly in the darkness where a small night lamp burns to discourage thieves and to offer guidance should someone need to descend. The paper, lacquer, and textile workshops that dominate certain streets in this district have all, or nearly all, completed this same transition, the craftsmen and the merchants and the apprentices who serve them seeking the restoration that sleep provides. You lie upon your futon, and the sounds of the district reach you filtered through the floor and the walls, the distant music from the pleasure quarter, the occasional voice of someone still abroad on necessary business, the bark of a dog claiming territory against the night. The steam from rice cookers escaping through bamboo vents has ceased, the cooking done, the embers banked for the morning's renewal. The evening smoke drifting across the rooftops has begun to thin as the fires die down, the city gradually surrendering its warmth to the cooling air. The Asakusa Cannon Temple lies quiet in its northern precinct, the gates closed against the night, the great lanterns darkened until the festival brings them to life again. The upcoming festival waits in the near future, a point of anticipation in the otherwise continuous flow of days. You will see the crowds, the performances, the temporary dissolution of ordinary order, and you will return to this shop, this ladder, this room above the work that sustains your family. The Sumida River flows, and the heron waits, and the peace holds. The memory of that night in 1657 lives in the construction of this building, in the earthen walls and the tiled roof, and the small barrel of water that stands ready in the passage. Your eyes close, and the sounds of the district become the texture of dreams, the ring of the brass scale transmuted into some other meaning, the sharp smell of indigo transformed into the landscape of sleep. The Chonin have their own dreams, their own night journeys, and you share with them the fundamental experience of rest, the body horizontal, the mind gradually releasing its hold upon the day's particulars. The copper coinage lies still now in the locked boxes of merchants and the hidden caches of householders, waiting for the morning's renewal of exchange. The lacquer work that your father has taught you, the application of urashi in thin layers, the sanding and the polishing, and the final glow that rewards proper attention. This skill will be your contribution to the continuing life of the district, your small mark upon the city. The fish market at Nihonbashi stirs before the sky has begun to lighten over Edo. You are standing at the edge of the wooden pier where the boats have begun to moor, their hulls scraping softly against the pilings. The bridge of Japan arches behind you in the darkness, its stone surface still cool from the night, and you can feel the first suggestion of the day's commerce gathering around its base. The official 0-kilometer marker for all Japanese roads stands somewhere in this district, though you cannot see it now, hidden as it is by shadows and the press of early workers. The market operates before dawn, with peak activity around 4 in the morning, and already the rhythm of that peak is building in the voices and footsteps that surround you. The metallic smell of fresh blood and seawater drifts across the black water, carried on a breeze that moves from the bay toward the city. You watch a fisherman unload his catch by lantern light, the tuna still twitching on the deck of his boat, their silver bodies reflecting the small flame that swings from a pole above his head. The fish are enormous, some longer than a man is tall, and their tails beat weakly against the wooden planks as he drags them toward the edge. Ice chipped from winter storage, melting in wooden crates, has been packed around the bodies of earlier catches, and the meltwater runs in thin streams across the deck and drips into the harbor below. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the particular salt density of the bay and the fainter, greener smell of the fishing villages up the coast. Fresh seafood arrives by boat from Tsukuji and nearby fishing villages, and you can see the proof of that journey in the nets still tangled in the gunwales, in the barnacles that mark the waterline of each hull. The fisherman grunts as he heaves the last of his tuna onto the cart that waits on the pier, and the cart's wheels creak under the weight. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with the practiced efficiency of those who have performed this ritual 10,000 times, who know the precise angle at which to lift a crate of shellfish, so that the water drains without spilling the living contents. The Nihonbashi district was rebuilt after fires with permanent stone buildings, and you can see the edges of those structures now, their corners emerging from the darkness as the sky begins its slow shift from black to the deep blue that precedes color. The auctioneer begins the rapid cry of competitive bidding. his voice rising and falling like a song that has no fixed melody, but follows instead the contours of commerce and competition. You move through the crowd toward the sound, your feet finding purchase on the wet planks where fish scales have begun to accumulate, slippery and iridescent in the lantern light. You understand without being told that this particular song has been sung in this place for generations, that the rhythms of his call have been refined across decades of mornings exactly like this one. The wholesalers control distribution to retail vendors across the city, and these men stand now in a loose semicircle around the auctioneer, their arms folded, their eyes assessing the quality of the catch with the speed of long practice. Wet hemp rope and cedar tubs are stacked in uneven piles along the edge of the auction space, and the rope has begun to dry in places where it has escaped the spray and the meltwater, stiffening into coils that will need to be soaked again before the next use. The cedar tubs hold smaller catches, bonito mostly, their striped sides dull in the dim light, and the wood of the tubs has darkened over years of contact with seawater and blood. Tuna, bonito, and shellfish are staples of the Edo diet, and the quantity of each that passes through this market each morning is enough to feed a city that has grown beyond any comparable settlement in the world. Edo's population requires enormous quantities of fish daily, and the scale of that requirement is visible in the number of boats that continue to arrive, in the carts that queue along the pier, in the voices that layer over one another in the growing light. You are standing now at the edge of the auction, close enough to see the auctioneer's face, the way his mouth shapes each syllable of his rapid cry, the way his hand moves in small gestures that punctuate the rising and falling of his voice. The saying, "not profitable until sold in Edo," reflects the city's commercial power, and you can feel the truth of that saying in the urgency of these transactions, in the way that fish caught yesterday in waters far from here must pass through this market, must receive the sanction of this auction, before their value can be fully realized. The shogunate regulates prices and quality through official inspectors, and you notice a man in a darker coat moving through the crowd, his eyes marking each lot with the detachment of one who serves a higher authority than profit alone. The first warmth of sunrise on wet cobblestones is still some time away, but the sky has begun to lighten in earnest now, the deep blue giving way to bands of lighter color near the eastern horizon. You can see the bridge of Japan more clearly, its stone curve catching the first indirect light, and beyond it, the shapes of buildings that house the commercial heart of Edo. You imagine the travelers who have ended their journeys at this point, the roads that radiate outward from this spot to every province of the realm. The solidity of those stone buildings speaks of a city that has learned from its own destruction, that has chosen to build in stone what was once built in wood. A restaurant buyer selects sea bream for a wealthy client's lunch, his fingers pressing into the flesh behind the gill with the certainty of one who has spent decades determining freshness by touch alone. You watch him lift the fish, turn it, set it down again with a nod that sends the seller into motion, wrapping the bream in damp cloth for transport. The market area includes stalls selling kitchen tools and seasonings, and already you can see the vendors of these goods stirring in their places, arranging their wares for the secondary wave of customers who will arrive after the auction has concluded. The metallic smell of fresh blood and seawater has begun to mingle now with the sharper scent of charcoal being lit in small braziers, the first preparation for the grilled fish and morning sake that will be offered to those who have worked through the darkest hours. The auctioneer continues his rapid cry, his voice seeming to have no need for breath, no pause between phrases. The men who have won their lots are already moving away, their purchases loaded onto carts or carried on broad shoulders toward the waiting streets. Ice chipped from winter storage, melting in wooden crates, is replenished by workers who move through the crowd with fresh blocks on their backs. the ice house somewhere in the district, still holding the cold of months past. You step aside to let one of these workers pass, and your foot finds a patch of scales that has not been scattered by the movement of the crowd. A porter slips on fish scales, but catches his balance, cursing softly under his breath, his hand finding the edge of a cedar tub for support. The wet hemp rope and cedar tubs that line the auction space have become hazards as well as tools, the accumulated moisture and organic matter of the market making every surface potentially treacherous. The porter rights himself, adjusts his load, moves on with the stoic acceptance of one who has slipped before and will slip again, for whom this is simply part of the labor. You watch him disappear into the crowd, and you notice how the light has changed, how the sky has moved from blue to the pale grey that precedes the first direct rays of the sun. The first warmth of sunrise on wet cobblestones reaches you now, not as warmth exactly, but as a change in the quality of the air, a slight lessening of the night's chill. The stone of the bridge of Japan has begun to show color, the grey emerging from the darkness, and the water of the canal below reflects the brightening sky in shifting patterns. The last of the boats from Tsukiji and the nearby fishing villages is mooring now, its captain calling out to a worker on the pier, their exchange brief and functional, the language of commerce stripped to its essential elements. Seasonal fish are celebrated in poetry and cuisine, and you recall without quite knowing how you know it that the sea bream of spring, the bonito of early summer, the mackerel of autumn each carry their own associations, their own place in the calendar of appreciation that governs the refined palate. The auctioneer concludes his rapid cry, his voice finding its resolution in the final strike of his wooden hammer. The crowd disperses in stages, some moving immediately toward the exits, others lingering to settle accounts, to arrange for delivery, to exchange the small courtesies that maintain relationships across years of buying and selling. The network of those relationships extends from this point to every corner of Edo, to the small shops where individual customers will appear later in the day, to the restaurants where the wealthy client will receive his sea bream prepared according to the season's expectation. You move with the dispersing crowd, your feet finding safer passage now that the auction has ended and the press of bodies has lessened. The metallic smell of fresh blood and seawater persists, but it has begun to share the air with other scents, the charcoal now fully lit, the first grilling of fish that will be sold to the workers as their morning meal. You pass one of the stalls selling kitchen tools and seasonings, its proprietor arranging small packets of dried bonito flakes, of seaweed, of the fermented seasonings that transform raw fish into the cuisine that has made this city famous. The first customers arrive at nearby stalls for grilled fish and morning sake, their faces showing the fatigue of those who have labored through the night, the satisfaction of those whose work is concluding as the city awakens. The first warmth of sunrise on wet cobblestones has become actual warmth now, the sun visible above the buildings to the east, its light touching the highest points of the bridge of Japan before reaching the lower levels of the district. You stand at the edge of the market, looking back at the scene you have moved through, the wooden pier now empty of boats, the auction space being swept by workers with wide brooms, the scales and meltwater pushed toward the drains that carry them back to the bay. You imagine the roads in this morning light, the travelers who have already set out from distant provinces, who will arrive in days or weeks at this point where all journeys converge. The stone buildings stand now in full sunlight, their surfaces warming, their permanence asserted against the transient chaos of the market. The wet hemp rope and cedar tubs that served the auction are being gathered, the rope coiled for drying, the tubs emptied and rinsed with buckets of bay water. Leftover fish are salted or dried for preservation, and you see this process beginning at the edge of the market, fish that did not find buyers being laid out on racks, being packed in salt, being prepared for a different kind of value, a longer duration of usefulness. The area attracts restaurants serving the latest catch by mid-morning, and already you can see the signs of these establishments preparing for their day. The doors opening, the floors being washed, the menus being written in careful calligraphy. The nearby money changer district handles the city's financial flows, and the connection between that district and this market is visible in the small strongboxes that move through the crowd, in the paper records that are being compiled by clerks who sit at portable desks, their brushes moving with the efficiency of those who must account for every transaction. The commercial heart of Edo beats in this rhythm of exchange, the fish passing from water to boat to cart to kitchen, the money passing in reverse, each movement recorded, each value established and confirmed. The adequacy of the city's diet, the nourishment of 1,000,000 souls, depends on the efficiency of this morning's work, on the relationships that have been maintained, on the systems that have been established across generations. You find yourself at a small stall, the proprietor offering you a portion of grilled fish on a wooden plate, the flesh still steaming, its surface marked by the grill in the pattern that indicates proper preparation. You are among the first customers now, your fatigue from the night's observation yielding to the satisfaction of this simple meal, this moment of pause before the day continues. The auctioneer's voice has given way to the ordinary conversations of the market's aftermath, the negotiations of delivery, the complaints about quality, the small jokes that pass between those who have shared this labor for years. The metallic smell of fresh blood and seawater has faded in this corner of the market, replaced by the richer, more complex aroma of cooked fish, of the oil that renders from the skin, of the charcoal that has done its work. You finish your meal, return the plate, exchange the small courtesies that conclude such transactions. The bridge of Japan stands above you, its arch now fully lit, its stone surface dry where the sun has reached it. You imagine the roads in this full light, the travelers who move along them even now, converging on this point from every direction. The morning light spreads across the eastern coastal plain, and you are walking among the first travelers to leave the post station at dawn. Dust rises from 100 feet on the dry coastal plain, soft clouds that hang ankle-high and turn the lower legs of passers-by a pale, uniform grey. The Tokaido was the eastern coastal road connecting Edo to Kyoto, and its surface has been pounded by generations of wooden sandals, by the hooves of pack horses, by the iron-rimmed wheels of heavy carts. You feel the road's unevenness through the thin soles of your own footwear, the ruts and hardened ridges that speak of yesterday's traffic and the traffic of seasons long past. The road stretched approximately 500 kilometers, though no single traveler holds this full distance in mind at once. The road exists in pieces, in the stretch between this station and the next, in the memory of yesterday's 15 kilometers and the anticipation of tomorrow's. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from the night's shelter, tying fresh bundles to their wooden pack frames, and the creak of those frames and the jingling of water gourds fills the early air with a percussion of departure. The salt wind from the Pacific mixes with the smell of horse sweat, a briny, musky combination that clings to the nostrils and identifies this road as coastal, as belonging to the edge where land meets the vast, dark water. You pass a group of pilgrims who have spent the night in the common room of a cheap inn, their white clothing still folded in their packs, their wooden staffs already bearing the marks of many kilometers. The shogunate required daimyo to travel to Edo regularly for sankinkotai, and this requirement moved like a slow tide through the economy of the road, supporting inns and porters and ferrymen who might otherwise have struggled through quieter seasons. But the pilgrims travel for older reasons, for obligations that predate the military government and will likely outlast it. Pilgrims travel to the Eye's grand shrine in what is now my prefecture, and their journey was measured not in the efficient days of official business, but in the devotional pace of those who walk towards something sacred. My prefecture lies on Honshu and over 200 outlying islands, a realm of fragmented coastlines and hidden coves that you will enter only in its northwestern corner, where the route crossed into that jurisdiction, part of the broader Kansai region. 53 official post stations line the route, and you are approaching the second of these since your departure from Nihonbashi, though the numbering counts from Kyoto, and you have not yet learned to think in that direction. Each station exists as a small town, a concentration of inns and stables and food stalls that materializes from the rural landscape like a knot in an otherwise smooth rope. The buildings here are wooden, their plaster walls marked with the soot of cooking fires, their tiled roofs curving upward at the corners in the manner that travelers have come to expect. A woman sells grilled rice balls to travelers at a roadside stall, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she turns the rice over charcoal, brushes each triangle with sauce, wraps it in a persimmon leaf that will impart a faint, astringent flavor. You watch her work for a moment, and the smell of toasting grain mingles with the salt wind and horse sweat, creating a layered atmosphere that belongs specifically to this hour, this spot of ground. The journey typically took travelers between 10 and 14 days on foot, though this estimate assumes reasonable weather and a body unburdened by age or infirmity. You have seen already how the road sorts its travelers by speed, how the fastest move to the left side and the slowest drift rightward toward the verge where grass and weeds reclaim the edge. A palanquin passes you, its curtains drawn against the dust, its bearers breathing in the synchronized rhythm of men who have learned to share a load without speaking. The Tokaido's traffic included every rank of Japanese society, from the highest officials who traveled with retinues of 200 to the solitary walker with no possessions but a staff and a bowl. The palanquin's lacquered frame catches the morning light, and then it is gone ahead, leaving you with the creak of wooden pack frames and jingling of water gourds that marks the more ordinary procession. By midday, the sun has climbed high enough to press against the top of your head, and you seek the shade of a roadside pine where other travelers have already gathered. A group of pilgrims sings a roadside hymn as they approach the next station town, their voices thin and wavering, uncertain of pitch but certain of purpose. The song speaks of purification, of the crossing of rivers, of the mountains that must be climbed before the sacred plain is reached. You do not know all the words, but the melody is simple, repetitive, designed to be learned by those who hear it once and carry it forward into their own journeys. Their songs formed an oral map, a way of marking progress through territory that most would see only once in their lives. The singing fades as they move ahead, and you remain in the pine shade, watching the dust rising from 100 feet on the dry coastal plain, the visible evidence of how many have passed this way before you. The afternoon brings a change in the road's character, the coastal flatness beginning to gather itself into low hills that foreshadow the mountain barrier ahead. You pass through a village where the houses cluster more tightly, where a small castle sits on a modest elevation overlooking the intersection of two roads. The shogunate's requirement that even minor lords make the journey to Edo, maintaining residences in the capital and leaving their domains in the care of deputies, extended to this place and its master. The castle's grey walls seem to watch the road with the same calculation that its lord applies to his obligations, measuring distance, measuring cost, measuring the political necessity against the agricultural calendar that demands attention at specific seasons. You do not enter the village, following the main road as it curves around the settlement's edge, but you see the fields beyond, the flooded paddies reflecting the afternoon sky in fragments of blue and white. Evening finds you at the next post station, where the inns cater to different classes, from palanquin-born officials to walking pilgrims. The building you enter is neither the finest nor the meanest, a middle establishment with clean straw mats, and a bathhouse whose water is changed with reasonable frequency. The proprietor takes your name and destination, writes them in his register with a brush that has worn to a point suited for quick, utilitarian characters. The inns of the Tokaido formed a parallel system of information, each proprietor knowing the condition of the road ahead, the location of recent bandit activity, the price of rice in the markets of the next major town. You eat a simple meal of miso soup and pickled vegetables. The salt taste a reminder of how close the sea remains, how the Pacific follows this road like a companion that will not be shaken. The creak of wooden pack frames and jingling of water gourds continues outside as later arrivals seek their own shelter, the sounds gradually diminishing as darkness completes its conquest of the sky. The second day begins with mist, a grey dissolution of boundaries that softens the road's edges and muffles the ordinary noises of departure. You walk in a bubble of visible world no more than 20 paces across, beyond which shapes suggest themselves without resolving into definite forms. A horse passes close enough to touch, its breath visible in the cool air, its rider invisible except for the dark suggestion of a hat brim. You have covered perhaps 30 of the road's 500 kilometers, a distance that feels simultaneously significant and negligible, a scratch upon a surface that extends beyond the imagination's easy grasp. The mist begins to lift by mid-morning, revealing the coastal scenery that it had concealed, the beaches of dark volcanic sand, the fishing boats drawn up beyond the tide line, the nets spread to dry in patches of grey and brown. You see fishermen mending their nets, their fingers moving with the automatic dexterity of long practice, their eyes following your progress without much interest, travelers being as common as seabirds in this landscape. The transition into what is now my prefecture remains invisible, unmarked by any sign or change in the road's construction. The administrative boundaries of Japan exist on maps and in the records of tax collectors, but the road knows only its own continuity, its insistence on connecting 2 points across the variations of terrain and jurisdiction. You walk through the morning, and the mist's memory lingers in the dampness of your clothing, in the sheen of moisture on the wooden staff you carry for balance on uneven ground. By afternoon, the road has turned inland, climbing gradually toward the mountain barrier that separates the coastal plain from the interior. You count the 53 post stations, now in the manner of a child reciting a lesson, trying to fix their names and order in memory against the confusion of actual travel. The hills grow steeper, the valleys narrower, the vegetation changing from the wind-sculpted pines of the coast to the denser growth of oak and cedar that marks the transition to mountain ecology. A stream runs beside the road, its water clear and cold, its sound a constant murmur that accompanies your footsteps. You stop to drink, cupping your hands in water that tastes of stone and shadow, of the deep places where it gathered before finding this channel to the sea. Hakone, at roughly 100 kilometers from Edo, was a difficult mountain passage, and you approach it across 2 days of gradual ascent, the road growing steeper, the air thinner and cooler with each hour of climbing. The inn where you spend the night before the final ascent is small, crowded, expensive, in the way of all places that control access to necessary passage. A merchant checks his account books at a table in the common room, calculating his losses to rain damage, his brush moving across the paper with short, angry strokes that contrast with the usual fluidity of commercial record-keeping. You watch him from across the room, his concentration so complete that he does not notice your attention. His goods, you learn from overheard conversation, are textiles from the Kyoto workshops, silks and cottons that have suffered water staining in a sudden storm 2 days previous. Merchants accepted such losses as the ordinary risk of trade, factoring them into prices, into the insurance arrangements that spread catastrophe across networks of capital. But this man seems to take the damage personally, as a failure of his own judgment, his brush strokes suggesting an argument with himself that the account books cannot resolve. The morning of the Hakone crossing dawns clear, the mountain's bulk visible from the inn's narrow windows, its upper slopes still holding patches of snow, though the season has advanced into spring. Pine needles carpet the mountain path, a soft, brown surface that yields underfoot and releases a resinous scent when disturbed. You begin the climb with others who have waited for this day, the road narrowing as it ascends, becoming a track that requires attention to each step. A palanquin bearer swaps with his partner, muscles trembling from the mountain climb, the exchange accomplished with practiced efficiency that minimizes the jostling of the passenger within. You see the tremor in the first bearer's hands as he accepts his water gourd, the way he leans against a rock while his breathing slows, his body gradually releasing the tension of the climb. The second bearer adjusts his grip, settles the poles across his shoulders, and the palanquin continues upward, leaving its first carrier to recover at his own pace. The view from the highest point of the pass reveals the road's full ambition, the coastal plain visible to the east, the descent toward the interior opening to the west, the volcanic lake of Ashinoko held in its crater like a dark mirror. The salt wind and hoarse sweat of the coast have been replaced by mountain air, sharp and thin, carrying the scent of mineral springs and the sulfur of geological activity. You rest at the summit station, where officials examine the wooden passports that travelers carried for inspection at barriers, verifying identity and permission to proceed. The barriers of the Tokaido represented the shogunate's insistence on control, on the knowledge of who moved where and for what purpose. Your own passage is routine, unremarkable, noted in a register that will be sent to Edo by courier and filed among thousands of similar records. The descent from Hakone proceeds through forest that thickens as elevation decreases, the trees growing taller, their canopy closing overhead to create a green twilight even at midday. Evening cicadas in the cedar trees around a post station begin their song as you approach the first settlement on the western slope, a sound that seems to emerge from the silence itself rather than from any visible insect. The inn where you spend this night is larger, more prosperous, situated at the junction of the mountain road and a secondary route that leads to the eye's grand shrine. Many pilgrims pass through this station, their white clothing and wooden staffs marking them as distinct from the commercial travelers with whom they shared the road. You sit in the common bath, your body absorbing heat after the mountain's cold, and listen to the conversations around you, the speculation about road conditions ahead, the exchange of news from Edo and Kyoto that forms the circulating intelligence of the traveling community. The third day beyond Hakone brings easier walking, the road descending through foothills that gradually soften into the plain of the interior. You are approaching the midpoint of the 10 to 14-day estimate, your body adjusting to the rhythm of continuous movement, your mind settling into the meditative state that long walking produces. Here the dust is different from that of the coastal plain, finer, more easily disturbed by the passage of feet, suggesting a different geology, a different history of erosion and deposition. You pass through fields of tea, the bushes trimmed to waist height, their leaves a deep green that seems almost black in certain lights. Workers move among the rows, plucking the new growth with gestures that have remained unchanged for generations, their baskets filling gradually with the raw material of a beverage that will travel to Edo, to the tea houses of the pleasure districts, to the austere rooms of Zen temples where it serves as aid to meditation. A ferry service crosses a wide river where bridges were forbidden for military reasons, the prohibition dating to an era of civil war when control of river crossings meant control of armies. You wait your turn among other travelers, the queue moving slowly as the flat-bottomed boat makes its repeated passages, loaded each time to the point where its gunwales seemed to touch the water's surface. The ferryman poles from the bow, his strength developed through years of resisting current, of finding the angle that allows the river's force to assist rather than oppose the crossing. You step aboard with a group of pilgrims, their white clothing bright against the darker garments of commercial travelers, their staffs held carefully to avoid tangling in the boat's limited space. The water moves past with a sound that suggests weight and speed, the surface brown with sediment from upstream mountains, carrying fragments of forest and field toward the distant sea. The crossing takes perhaps 10 minutes, though time stretches in the boat's confinement, the shore seeming to approach with deliberate slowness. On the western bank, the road continues through country that grows increasingly cultivated, the villages closer together, the fields more intensively worked. You sense the approach of older Japan, of the cultural centers that predate the shogunate's establishment in Edo. Kyoto had been the imperial capital from 794 to 1868, a span of more than 1,000 years that has deposited layers of history in its streets and buildings, its temples and gardens. Kyoto's name literally means imperial residence or capital, a designation that persists even though the political center has shifted eastward, even though the emperor himself now resides in a palace in Edo, renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital. 14 temples and shrines in Kyoto were declared UNESCO World Heritage in 1994, though this recognition lies far in your future, unimaginable in the present moment of dusty walking, of gradual approach through the accumulating afternoons. The fourth evening finds you at a post station where a traveling haiku poet has established himself in the corner of the common room, his brush and inkstone arranged with the precision of one who has learned to write in difficult circumstances. At evening, the poet notes the sound of a distant waterfall, his head tilting slightly as he listens, his hand moving to capture the sensation before it fades into the general texture of evening. You do not approach him, respecting the concentration that composition requires, but you hear the words he speaks aloud as he writes, the 17 syllables arranged in the pattern of 5, 7, 5, the reference to autumn, to loneliness, to the sound of water that persists when all other sounds have diminished. The evening cicadas in the cedar trees have begun their song, and the poet's verse seems to emerge from this sonic environment, to be part of it rather than a description of it, the distinction between observation and participation having dissolved in the gathering darkness. You sleep that night in a room that smells of cedar, the wood's natural preservative qualities keeping insects at bay, allowing the screens to remain open to the mild air. The inns of the Tokaido had evolved forms of hospitality that balanced the needs of rest against the requirements of early departure, of schedules determined by daylight and distance rather than by individual preference. You wake before dawn, as you have woken each morning, the habit of travel imposing its own discipline on bodies that might otherwise have slept longer. The inn's servants are already moving, preparing rice, heating water, performing the 1,000 small tasks that allow the day's traffic to proceed. You eat quickly, pay your account, and step into the grey light that precedes sunrise, the road visible as a pale line through the dimness, continuing toward its western terminus with the patience of infrastructure that has outlasted the generations that built it. The final days of walking bring you through country that grows increasingly familiar from description, from the paintings and prints that have circulated through Edo, through the conversations of those who have made this journey before you. You have covered perhaps 400 of the road's 500 kilometers, the remaining distance compressing in imagination even as it extends in actual ground to be traversed. You pass through a town where a festival is in preparation, banners hung across the streets, platforms constructed for the display of portable shrines. The processions of daimyo through towns like this one had become occasions for display, for the competitive expenditure that demonstrated wealth and loyalty simultaneously. But the festival you approach belongs to older rhythms, to agricultural and religious calendars that the military government acknowledged without fully controlling. The salt wind from the Pacific and the smell of horse sweat return as you descend toward the final coastal plain, the road curving to follow the shoreline of Eyes Bay, the water visible through gaps in the buildings, through the screening pines. You see some of my prefecture's outlying islands now, low shapes on the horizon that might be clouds or might be land, the distinction uncertain in the haze of distance. The pilgrims bound for the Eye's grand shrine increase in number as you approach the sacred center, their white clothing more frequent, their staffs more numerous, the atmosphere of common purpose thickening like the humidity of the approaching summer. You are not bound for Eyes. Your destination remains Kyoto, but you share the road with those who are, and their devotion imposes a temporary gentleness on the usual commerce of travel, a slowing of pace, a softening of voice. The last post station before Kyoto spreads across a wide plain where the road divides, one branch leading to the imperial city, the other continuing to the shrine. You rest here, knowing that tomorrow's walking will bring you to the end of this particular journey, to the gates of a city whose name has meant capital for longer than most nations have existed. The inns cater to different classes, from palanquin-born officials to walking pilgrims, and you observe the full range of this hierarchy in the station's single street, the elaborate processions of the wealthy arriving as you did, on foot, dusty, anonymous. This is the 53rd station, the final accounting before the traveler passes into the jurisdiction of the destination, becomes the responsibility of urban authorities rather than road officials. You sit that evening in the inn's garden, a small space of raked gravel and pruned shrubs that offers the illusion of countryside within the settlement's density. The evening cicadas have begun, though here they compete with urban sounds, with the clatter of kitchens, the voices of merchants closing their shops, the distant music of a pleasure quarter that has established itself to serve the transient population. You buy one, taste the familiar combination of toasted grain and leaf, and understand how this flavor will become associated in memory with this specific moment, this threshold between the road and its ending. The final morning breaks with a clarity that seems to promise revelation, the sky overhead deepening from rose to blue as the sun clears the eastern mountains. You walk through the outskirts of Kyoto, the buildings growing denser, more permanent, more ornate in their decoration. The western end of the Tokaido dissolves gradually into the city's street network, the distinction between road and urban space becoming arbitrary, a matter of administrative definition rather than visible difference. You pass a temple whose gate towers above the surrounding structures, its timber dark with age, its roof tiles green with the accumulated growth of centuries. The imperial palace lies ahead, its walls low compared to the castles of the military elite, its gardens extensive, its presence more suggested than asserted in that you are standing in a narrow alley in eastern Edo, where the morning light has not yet reached the ground. Around you, the walls of wooden workshops press close, their upper stories leaning slightly toward one another across the passage. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil drifts from a doorway ahead, mingling with the sharper scent of river fish from a nearby market. Your feet find the worn groove of a stone step, polished by decades of artisans arriving before dawn. Somewhere above, a single crow crosses between the rooftops, its shadow passing over your hands like a brief acknowledgement of your presence in this place. Ukiyo-e means pictures of the floating world, and this meaning lives in every room along this street. The genre reflected the worldview of the rising merchant class and common people, those who had begun to shape the tastes of Edo with their new wealth and their hours of leisure. You move through the alley as the first lamps are lit within the workshops, their glow casting rectangles of warm amber onto the darkened plaster. The cold touch of a bearing handle worn smooth by decades of use awaits on a bench inside the nearest studio, where a man has already begun his day's labor. A designer sits at a low table, sketching a courtesan's portrait by lamplight, revising the line of her sleeve. His brush moves in short, certain strokes, then pauses, then moves again. The paper before him shows a figure in the act of turning, her kimono's sleeve extended in a gesture of farewell or perhaps invitation. He studies the curve where fabric meets wrist, where the pattern of irises must follow the fold without breaking the illusion of movement. You observe the concentration in his shoulders, the slight forward tilt of his body as he leans to correct a line that had seemed right moments before, but now reveals itself as too heavy, too insistent upon the eye. The lamplight pools across his work, leaving the corners of the room in soft shadow where other sketches hang like whispered possibilities. Pigment powder floats in sunbeams from the high window, golden particles rising and settling in the still air. The designer's brush hovers, descends, lifts again. He has been working since before you arrived, and will continue until the light through that high window grows strong enough to reveal the flaws that lamplight conceals. The courtesan's face remains blank, a featureless oval that will receive its expression last, when the certainty of the body's posture has been established beyond doubt. Around you, the walls hold pinned studies of hands, of the particular drape of heavy silk, of the way hair escapes its pins at the nape. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil settles into your clothing as you stand in this room where pictures of the floating world are born from patience and revision. Edo was the primary center of Ukiyo-e production, and this fact announces itself in the density of workshops, in the specialized shops that supply paper and pigment, and the particular knives that carve cherrywood into printing surfaces. You leave the designer to his courtesan and step into the next room of the studio, where a carver turns a cherrywood block, testing the grain with his thumb. His bench holds a magnifying glass, a mallet, a dozen blades of varying curvature laid across a cloth. The block before him bears the pencil lines of the designer's drawing, transferred in reverse so that the printed image will read correctly. His thumb moves across the surface, reading the wood's willingness to hold fine detail, its resistance to splitting along the chisel's edge. The art form included illustrated books and color woodblock prints, and this carver has spent 30 years moving between these applications. His hands show the accumulated marks of his trade, small white scars where the berin has slipped, where the mallet has struck awry. You watch him select a tool, examine its edge against the light from the high window, then set it aside for another whose curve better matches the line he must follow. The rhythmic sound of the baron pressing paper to block will come later in the printer's domain, but here the sounds are sharper, more intermittent, the tap of mallet on chisel handle, the whisper of steel finding its path through cherrywood. Drying ink carries a faint chemical sharpness through the workshop, though no printing has occurred today. The carver works in anticipation of this future state, creating the matrix from which color and line will emerge. His thumb pauses at a knot in the grain, and he adjusts his angle to accommodate this resistance. The block will pass through many hands before it reaches the final purchaser, and each hand must understand the limitations and possibilities of the others. You observe the methodical progress, the way each line is established through a series of shallow cuts that deepen only when their placement has been confirmed. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil intensifies as the blade lifts its thin curls, as the carver's bench accumulates the physical evidence of his concentration. Katsushika Hokusai was born in 1760 in eastern Edo, in what is now Sumida, Tokyo, and though he is not present in this particular workshop, his influence permeates the district like weather. Hokusai created approximately 3,000 color prints during his long career, a productivity that helped reshape what the floating world might contain. He illustrated over 200 books, extending the reach of his vision into narratives that readers could unfold at their own pace, returning to images that rewarded repeated examination. You sense his absent presence in the confidence of the carver's hand, in the designer's willingness to revise a sleeve's line until it achieves a particular flowing quality that Hokusai had demonstrated possible. The high window admits more light now, and the pigment powder floating in sunbeams becomes visible again, disturbed by some movement in an adjacent room. The carver lifts his work to examine it against the light, turning the block so that the incised lines catch the illumination at their proper angle. Satisfied, he sets it aside and reaches for another block, this one prepared for a different color layer. The collaboration between designer, carver, and printer required by woodblock printing becomes apparent in the sequence of blocks accumulating on his bench, each bearing a portion of the final image, each dependent upon the others for its ultimate meaning. You move past him into the space where the printer awaits the completion of these preparations, where paper and pigment and the precise moment of their meeting will determine the quality of what the market receives. A printer applies the first color, watching for the precise moment to lay the paper. His station holds brushes of varying stiffness, pigments in ceramic dishes, a tub of water that receives the paper before printing to ensure its flexibility. The block he uses has already passed through the carver's hands, its surface raised in the pattern that will receive the pigment. He works with a rhythm established through thousands of repetitions, the brush loading color, the block receiving it, the paper descending at the angle that prevents air from trapping beneath its surface. Pigments were derived from minerals and plants, including Prussian blue imported from Europe, and this particular printer has mixed his morning supply to a consistency that he tests with his thumbnail. The blue sits in its dish with a depth that seems to hold distance itself, the color of winter skies and deep water. You observe the printer's eyes, how they move between the block and the paper, calculating the precise instant when pigment and fiber will achieve their proper marriage. Too soon, and the color pools; too late, and it dries before the transfer completes. The printer's hands show their own specialization. The fingertips harden to a leather-like resilience that can feel the paper's readiness through touch alone. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil persists as background, but here the dominant presence is the pigment itself, the mineral earthiness of ground stone, the vegetal undertone of organic dyes. Drying ink with a faint chemical sharpness begins to assert itself as the first impressions leave the printer's station and are carried to the lines strung across the workshop ceiling. Finished prints dry on cords strung across the workshop ceiling, their surfaces still vulnerable to smearing, to the touch of a careless sleeve. You watch an assistant reach to adjust a hanging sheet, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes measuring the distance between his body and the wet color above. Hokusai abandoned the traditional subjects of actors and courtesans, and this departure opened the floating world to landscapes, to the daily life of common people, to the mountain that would become his most persistent obsession. His 36 views of Mount Fuji actually contains 46 prints, the additional 10 added when the series proved more popular than anticipated, the mountain appearing through rain, through clear air, from the vantage of bridges and boats, and the distant sea. The most famous print is the Great Wave off Kanagawa from 1831, and you sense its approaching creation in the confidence of these workshops, in the technical mastery that would make such an image possible. The printer applies a second color to another block, the paper having been retrieved from its first hanging, now ready to receive the next layer of its becoming. The high window reaches its maximum illumination, and the pigment powder floating in sunbeams achieves a temporary visibility, each particle a brief world of color suspended in its slow descent. You move beneath these sunbeams, your own shadow passing across the printer's station without disturbing his concentration. Around you, the accumulated impressions of previous days hang in various states of completion, some awaiting only their final black outline, others still bearing single colors that will find their completion in tomorrow's labor. A publisher's agent arrives to collect the day's work for the morning market, his entrance announced by the particular quality of light that enters with him through the workshop's front door. He moves among the drying prints with the assessment of long practice, his fingers hovering without touching, his eyes reading the quality of impression, the registration of colors, the marketability of subjects. The designer's courtesan has reached the carver's bench, her sleeves line now translated into the negative space of raised and lowered wood. The carver turns a cherrywood block, testing the grain with his thumb, beginning the process that will allow her to multiply into hundreds of identical presences, each available to a purchaser for the cost of a modest meal. This agent's rounds will take him to 6 more workshops before the morning market opens. He wraps selected impressions in protective paper, noting quantities and subjects in a ledger whose pages show the accumulated transactions of months. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil follows him as he moves, clinging to the fibers of his clothing, announcing his profession to those who encounter him in the street. You watch him pause at a particular print, a landscape in Prussian blue, the color still slightly startling in its intensity, its foreign origin. Hokusai died in 1849 in Asakusa, far from the eastern Edo of his birth, having changed his residence more than 90 times across his long working life. His final years continued the productivity that had characterized his existence, the thousands of works accumulating behind him like the wake of a boat that never ceases its forward motion. You sense the future weight of this achievement as the agent departs with his selections, as the workshop returns to the rhythm of production without the interruption of commerce. The printer applies another color, watching for the precise moment to lay the paper, and the cycle continues as it has continued for decades, as it will continue until the floating world itself finds new forms of expression. The afternoon light shifts across the workshop, and the pigment powder floating in sunbeams changes its angle of descent, settling now upon the eastern surfaces of the room. You find a place near the drying lines, where the finished prints hang like captured moments of weather, of gesture, of the particular blue that only this mixture achieves. Drying ink with a faint chemical sharpness surrounds you, the smell of completion and anticipation together. You observe the social world of Edo in these accumulated images, the tastes and aspirations of a population newly wealthy enough to purchase beauty for its walls, for its albums, for the illustrated books that circulate through lending libraries and private collections. The carver's anonymous contribution to a culture of reproduction has shaped the blocks that make this circulation possible, the many valued over the unique in a system that prizes accessibility. Evening approaches, and the lamplight that began the designer's work returns to illuminate the final tasks of the day. The carver sets aside his nearly completed block, wraps his tools in their cloth, prepares to continue tomorrow where interruption has found him. The printer completes his last impressions and hangs them among their predecessors on the cords strung across the workshop ceiling, where they will dry through the night, attended only by the watchman who passes with his lantern at irregular intervals. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil intensifies in the cooling air, becoming more assertive as the day's activity releases its hold upon the space. You remain as the others depart, standing in the diminishing light from the high window, observing the workshop in its state of temporary rest. Ukiyo-e means pictures of the floating world, and this floating quality seems most apparent now, in the moment between labor and sleep, when the images hang in their unfinished state, neither fully present nor fully absent. The evidence of illustrated books and color woodblock prints surrounds you, the stacked volumes awaiting their covers, the loose sheets awaiting their sorting and binding. You have witnessed the collaboration between designer, carver, and printer across the hours of this day, the seamless passing of responsibility from one hand to the next. The last sunbeam withdraws from the high window, and the pigment powder becomes invisible, though you know it continues its slow settlement upon every surface. You move toward the door, your passage disturbing the air enough to set the drying prints swaying slightly on their cords, a gentle motion like breathing, like the floating world itself in its constant, ungraspable movement. The night watchman's lantern passes the front of the workshop, its light briefly entering, briefly withdrawing, as the city of Edo continues its vast and various life, beyond these walls where pictures of the floating world are made. Hokusai created approximately 3,000 color prints over 70 years, and this number seems to expand in the darkness, to suggest not merely quantity, but the possibility of inexhaustible vision, of a world that yields new aspects to those who persist in their looking. He illustrated over 200 books, and each book represents a sequence of openings, of left and right pages in dialogue, of the reader's hand moving to turn and continue. You stand in the doorway now, the workshop behind you settling into its night presence, the drying ink with a faint chemical sharpness gradually diminishing as oxidation completes its work. The alley outside has cooled, the stone step that received your morning weight, now releasing its stored warmth into the evening air. Around you, the other workshops have likewise emptied, their lamps extinguished, their artisans dispersed to the small rooms where they sleep, where they dream perhaps of lines that flow correctly, of colors that register without misalignment. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil follows you as you move through the alley, becoming fainter, becoming memory, as the sounds of the city's night assert their own claims upon attention. Somewhere, a dog announces its presence. Somewhere, a late boat passes on the river that gives this district its particular character, its access to the commerce that feeds the production you have witnessed. His work influenced European artists including Van Gogh, Gauguin, Monet, and Sisley, though this influence belongs to a future that these artisans cannot anticipate, a reversal of the importation that brings Prussian blue to their palates. This European interest was part of the broader Japanisme movement, a term that will be coined in France decades hence, a recognition of the aesthetic power that these workshops produce with such matter-of-fact daily persistence. Japanisme particularly influenced Impressionism, Art Nouveau, and Jugendstil, movements that we'll find in the flat plains of Ukiyo-e, in its bold outlines and unmodulated color, a liberation from the conventions of Western representation. The Vienna Secession and Expressionism also drew on Japanese aesthetics, extending the reach of these workshop productions into territories unimagined by their makers. You emerge from the alley into a broader street, where a few lanterns still mark the presence of food vendors, of the small commerce that continues when the larger markets have closed. The floating world includes these moments too, the evening meal, the brief respite before sleep, the observation of others in their own passages through the city's spaces. A cat crosses your path, pauses to observe your presence, continues into the darkness with the indifference of those who belong fully to a place. The river appears before you, its surface holding the reflection of a few remaining lights, its movement audible in the small sounds of water finding its way past moored boats, past the pilings of bridges that connect the city's districts. You stand at its edge, allowing the sound to occupy your attention, to slow the thoughts that the day's observations have accumulated. Hokusai died in 1849 in Asakusa, and this death will occur in a different quarter of the city, a different phase of his restless relocations, But the river connects all quarters, all phases, all the moments of a life spent in the production of visible things. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil has dissipated entirely now, replaced by the mineral scent of moving water, the faint organic presence of the river's own life. You remain at the river's edge as the city settles into its deeper night, the last vendors extinguishing their lamps, the last boats finding their moorings. The high window of the workshop faces east, and when the light returns, it will find the carver already at his bench, the designer already revising some line that refused its proper flow in yesterday's attempt. The pigment powder floating in sunbeams will become visible again, the same particles or others like them, the same light or light that falls with the same angle at this season. This centrality of Edo in Ukiyo-e production will persist, will intensify, before the city's transformation into Tokyo, before the workshops adapt to new markets, new technologies, new forms of the floating world that their predecessors could not have envisioned. You turn from the river, finding your path through streets that grow quieter, that seem to expand in their emptiness, the buildings losing their particularity as the darkness completes its claim upon visual detail. Sleep claims the city in degrees, the artisans in their small rooms, the watchmen in their rounds, the cats in their chosen territories. You move through this claiming as one who belongs to it, your footsteps soft upon surfaces that have received countless other footsteps across the years of Edo's growth, its assertion as a center of the merchant class and common people, its production of a culture that will travel farther than its makers could have intended. The smell of cherrywood shavings and walnut oil returns in memory, more vivid than the actual scent of night air, more persistent than the river's mineral presence. Drying ink with a faint chemical sharpness likewise persists, the workshop's atmosphere having entered your clothing, your hair, the porous surfaces of your attention. You find a place to rest, a corner where the wall meets another wall, where the roof's extension creates a shallow shelter against the dew that will form before morning. The floating world continues its existence beyond your observation, the images multiplying in their thousands, finding their way to distant rooms, to future collectors, to the European artists including Van Gogh, Gauguin, Monet, and Sisley, who will study them with the intensity of conversion. The night deepens, and your breathing finds a rhythm that matches the rivers, the cities, the persistent pulse of a culture that does not cease its production even in apparent rest. You sink into the rhythm of your own breathing, the floating world floating now in the medium of approaching sleep, the images of the day dissolving into the images that sleep will provide, the workshop becoming memory, becoming dream. The last conscious sensation is of the pigment powder settling upon your eyelashes, each particle a brief world of color suspended in its slow descent, the same particles that floated through the morning air of the workshop, now finding their rest upon you as you find yours, the floating world, and your own attention to it, finally indistinguishable in the darkness before dawn. You are standing at the edge of a covered walkway in Uno, in northern Edo, where the afternoon rain has softened the edges of every roof and stone. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the mineral scent of wet earth from the garden paths beyond. Around you, the merchants have closed their awnings, and the last pilgrims are hurrying toward the temple gates before the heavier evening rain arrives. You watch a poet approach from the eastern road, his traveling coat dark with moisture, his wooden clogs clicking against the wet stones as he brushes rain from his shoulders with a gesture of long practice. The Teahouse waits at the end of this walkway, its wooden frame darkened by decades of smoke and weather, its paper lanterns already glowing with a pale amber light against the grey afternoon. You follow the poet through the low entrance, bending beneath the lintel, and the interior warmth wraps around you like a second garment. The mineral steam of matcha rising from a cracked ceramic bowl greets your arrival, mixing with the older smells of old wood, and the particular dampness of straw matting that has known many seasons of feet and rain. Wet straw matting and the smell of old would define the threshold between the outer weather and this contained world of voices and waiting poems. The host, a woman of perhaps 60 years, moves from the preparation alcove with a kettle in her left hand and a cloth in her right. She does not speak as she places the steaming water before the low table where 3 poets have already arranged their cushions in a semicircle. You take your place at the edge of this gathering, your back to the garden window where rain on the broad leaves of the Teahouse garden creates a continuous whisper against the glass. The host retreats, and the poets begin their slow settling, adjusting their robes, producing folded papers from their sleeves, testing the weight of their ink stones upon the lacquered table surface. Matsuo Basho lived from 1644 to 1694, and though he has been gone for more than a century, his presence inhabits this room like a held note. The poets speak his name quietly, as one names a teacher who has become something larger than memory. Basho renewed Heikai poetry and gained it recognition as serious literature, transforming a form of entertainment into a practice of spiritual attention, and the men gathered here tonight continue that transformation in their own modest way. You observe the oldest of them, his beard streaked with white, as he warms his hands above the tea bowl and closes his eyes in what might be prayer or merely the pleasure of heat against chilled fingers. The rain intensifies against the garden leaves, and the sound seems to enter the room not as noise, but as a quality of attention, a reminder that the world outside continues its own indifferent music. The distant, irregular strike of a temple bell reaches you now, carried on a shift of wind through the wet air, and the poets pause in their preparations to listen. The bell comes from one of the temples for which Yuno was known, though the cherry trees stand bare now in the late winter, their branches black against the grey sky. The sound of temple bells was a common subject in Edo period poetry, and you sense each man in the room measuring this particular strike against the ideal bell he carries in his mind. The first poet to speak is the youngest, a man perhaps 30 years old, his fingers ink-stained at the tips from morning composition. He unfolds a single sheet and reads his verse on the sound of a crow in the winter temple yard, his voice low and unhurried, each syllable given its full weight in the humid air. The particular silence after a poem is read aloud settles over the gathering, a silence that is not empty but populated with each listener's unfinished response. You feel this silence in your own body, a slight held tension in the shoulders, a waiting that asks nothing and expects nothing, merely holds the poem as one holds water in cupped hands. The host returns with more steaming water, and the mineral steam of matcha, rising from a cracked ceramic bowl, mingles with the steam from the kettle, creating a small cloud at the center of the table. The second poet, a thin man with a persistent cough, declines the fresh tea and instead produces 17 drafts of a single poem from a leather case at his side. You watch him spread these papers across the matting with the tenderness of a physician examining symptoms. Traditional haiku use 3 phrases of 5-7-5 mora, and the seasonal reference, kigo, is essential. So his search is not mere perfectionism, but a necessary discipline, the finding of the exact door through which the reader will enter the poem's brief architecture. You shift upon your cushion, and the wet straw matting and the smell of old would remind you of other rooms, other afternoons of rain and waiting. The poet with his 17 drafts selects the 12th version and reads it aloud, then the 14th, then returns to the 12th, his voice unchanged in its quiet cadence. The others offer no commentary, no praise or correction, for the poem is not yet finished in their hearing. Haiku texts remain open and incomplete, finishing in the reader's experience, and these men understand that their role is to offer the vessel, not to drink from it on another's behalf. Emotions are rarely named directly in haiku, and so the room contains no declarations of beauty or sorrow, only the facts of bell sound, of winter crow, of steam rising and dispersing. The afternoon light fails in the garden, and rain on the broad leaves of the Teahouse garden becomes invisible, audible only. The host brings lamps, and the particular silence after a poem is read, aloud transforms into the larger silence of evening settling, of day completing its obligations. You are aware of your own breathing, of the slight ache in your legs from the seated position, of the warmth at your back from a brazier whose coals glow without flame. The distant, irregular strike of a temple bell comes again, closer now, perhaps from a nearer temple, or perhaps the same bell carried on a changed wind, and the oldest poet smiles without opening his eyes. Yosa Busen was born in 1716 in Kema, in what is now Osaka, and though he too is absent from this room, his paintings of the natural world hang in the alcove, their colors faded to the gentle spectrum of age. Busen's real surname was Taniguchi, a fact that matters to no one now except scholars and the few who maintain the lineage of his students. More than 200 of Busen's haiku were discovered in 2015 in a forgotten anthology, a resurrection that would have pleased him, you think, a man who spent his life seeking the overlooked, the single moment of perception that outlasts its occasion. Busen died on January 17, 1784, in Kyoto, and the date carries its own kigo, its own season of ending, of final snow upon the northern capital. The poets speak of him now, of his travels, of the tea houses that served as gathering places for poets and artists across the western provinces. This room continues that function without self-consciousness, without the need to name itself as tradition. The host replenishes the water, and the mineral steam of matcha rising from a cracked ceramic bowl marks the passage of another hour, the slow turning of the afternoon into evening that you feel in your own body as a softening, a loosening of the day's particular urgencies. Kobayashi Issa lived from 1763 to 1827, and his name enters the conversation like a child's voice in a room of adults, his poems of insects and small griefs, of the poverty that never quite defeated his tenderness. The poets speak of him with a different quality of attention, a recognition that heikai could accommodate the personal without becoming merely confessional. Senryu share the haiku form but focus on personal and emotional subjects, and the boundary between these forms occupies the next hour of discussion, the men trading examples, testing the permeable membrane between observation and feeling. You listen without following every turn, the words becoming texture rather than argument, the sound of thought being thought in good company. The rain diminishes to a barely perceptible whisper against the garden, and the wet straw matting and the smell of old wood seem to exhale the accumulated moisture of the day. The particular silence after a poem is read aloud, occurs less frequently now, the conversation having shifted to anecdote, to the recounting of journeys and the characters of distant teachers. You remain at the edge of the circle, present without participation, the second person of this scene not as protagonist, but as witness, as the consciousness that holds the room without altering it. Masaoka Shiki, who coined the term haiku, lived from 1867 to 1902, and his name appears only once, near the end of the gathering, spoken by the youngest poet with a certain hesitation, as one names the future. The others receive it without response, the name hanging in the lamplit air, a reminder that the form they practice will outlast their own terminology, their own understanding of what they do. You feel the weight of this future without apprehending its details, the way one feels the presence of a mountain hidden by mist, its mass known through the behavior of the air. At evening, the group disperses, each carrying a folded paper of the day's verses, the collected work of their attention, the poems that will be revised or abandoned, sent to distant correspondents or burned in private ceremony. You watch them don their traveling coats, resume their clogs, step into the darkness where the rain has stopped, and the sky shows the first cleared patches of star-bearing black. The host extinguishes the lamps one by one, and you remain a moment longer in the darkened room, the mineral steam of matcha rising from a cracked ceramic bowl now only memory, only the ghost of warmth in the cooling air. The distant, irregular strike of a temple bell comes a final time, and you rise, your body stiff from the long sitting, and move toward the garden door. Rain on the broad leaves of the Teahouse garden has ceased, and the leaves hold their water in trembling globes that catch the starlight. The wet straw matting and the smell of old wood release you to the outer world, the path between the Teahouse and the temple gate, the night that waits without urgency for your next attention. You walk slowly, the folded paper of verses warm in your sleeve. The particular silence after a poem is read aloud, now internalized, become the quality of your own footsteps on the drying path. Uno was known for its temples and cherry blossoms, and you pass beneath the bare branches of those famous trees, their buds still invisible, their flowering still months away, yet present in the dark architecture of their waiting. The path turns toward the main road, and you feel the night air move across your face, cooler now that the rain has passed, carrying the mineral scent of the city's edge, the river not far, the fields beyond. You are standing at a threshold, as you have stood before, as you will stand again, the poems you carry unread, their completion waiting in some future moment of solitude, some morning or midnight when the words will rise to meet your experience. The Teahouse recedes behind you, its light extinguished, its host perhaps already sleeping in her quarters above the preparation room, her dreams containing no poems, only the ordinary images of a life spent in service to the temporary gathering. You continue walking, and the city around you settles into its night rhythms, the last voices fading from the road, the first dogs beginning their watchful barking. The particular silence after a poem is read aloud has become the silence of the world itself, the pause between one thing and the next, the held breath of attention that is the beginning of all making. You think of the 17 drafts abandoned on the Teahouse table, the poet's search for the precise season word, and you understand that this search continues in you now, in every perception that asks to be named, to be held in the brief form that outlasts its making. The stars clarify above the temple roofs, and the distant, irregular strike of a temple bell does not come again, its silence itself a kind of sound, a presence defined by absence. You walk on, the verses in your sleeve a small weight against your side, the night opening around you like a room whose dimensions you are only beginning to measure. The road descends toward the river, and the wet straw matting and the smell of old wood give way to the colder smells of water and stone, the bank where the ferry waits, its lantern a single point in the darkness. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though it is not yet dawn, the metaphor of arrival already present in your fatigue, your readiness to cross, to be carried to the further shore. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in dream, in the half-sleep that transforms every perception into its related but ungovernable form, the bell becoming a voice, the water becoming light, the poem becoming the breath that reads it. You lie down at last, the folded paper set aside, the verses given to the darkness that will complete them in ways the poets never intended, the readers never imagined. The particular silence after a poem is read aloud, becomes the silence of your own body, the slowing of the heart, the lengthening of the intervals between one breath and the next. Rain on the broad leaves of the Teahouse garden returns as memory, as the first sound of a rain that falls elsewhere, that has always been falling, that will continue when you have ceased to hear it. The distant, irregular strike of a temple bell marks some hour you do not count, some moment in a sequence that requires no witness. The last conscious sensation is of the mineral steam of matcha rising from a cracked ceramic bowl, the warmth against your palms, the green taste on your tongue, the poem not yet written that waits in the space between this breath and the next, the bell that has ceased yet continues in the inner ear, the night that holds you as the Teahouse held you, without demand, without duration, offering only the present that deepens into rest, into the long continuation of attention that is itself the only completion any poem requires. The morning of the last day of the old year finds you standing in a narrow lane in Nihonbashi, where a carpenter and his 2 sons are binding pine branches to freshly cut bamboo stalks. The traditional Japanese calendar divided the year into 24 seki, and this final division, called Daikon, marks the deepest cold before the turning. Around you, the resinous smell of pine decorations at New Year drifts from every doorway where kadamatsu have been raised to welcome the ancestral spirits and the gods of the harvest. The carpenter's fingers work slowly in the grey light, wrapping straw cord around the junction of pine and bamboo, while his sons hold the stalks steady against the wind that comes from the river. You are watching the most important festival take shape in ordinary hands, with 7 days of ritual observance stretching ahead like a road newly cleared of snow. The bamboo gleams pale green where the bark has been stripped, and the pine needles darken almost to black against the white plaster walls of the merchant houses. A woman passes carrying a bucket of water for the final purification of her entryway, and the sound of her wooden clogs echoes against the frozen mud of the street. The carpenter murmurs to his sons about the angle of the branches, how the pine must lean slightly eastward to greet the rising sun of the new year. The straw cord creaks as he tightens it, and somewhere behind you, a shutter opens to release the smell of grilled fish and miso soup into the cold air. The kadamatsu will stand until the 7th day, when they will be gathered and burned at the neighborhood shrine, their purpose of welcoming complete, their temporary beauty surrendered to flame and smoke. You move through streets where every threshold bears its own offering of pine and bamboo, some grand with 3 tiers of stalks before the gates of samurai residences, others modest as a single branch tied with red and white paper at a tradesman's door. Each gateway marks the passage from one seki to the next with patient repetition. The sky above Nihonbashi remains the color of unpolished silver, and the cold moves through your sleeves as you walk toward the river, where boats are unloading the last supplies before the 3 days of commercial silence that New Year demands. The water carries the smell of tidal mud and distant snow, and the voices of the boatmen reach you across the dark surface with the flatness that cold air imposes on all sound. The first day of the new year arrives without thunder or announcement, only the gradual lightening of a sky that seems to hold its breath. You are standing at the entrance of a small shrine in Asakusa, where the priest has scattered salt across the threshold and hung a sacred rope of twisted straw before the image of the deity. The most important festival, with 7 days of ritual observance, has begun in the silence between darkness and the first thin color in the east. Around you, families approach in their best clothing, the women in patterned silk that rustles with each step, the men in formal black with the family crest visible at the shoulder. The priest rings a single bell, and the sound falls into the waiting air like a stone into deep water, spreading ripples that seem to touch the farthest corners of the precinct. Children run across the frozen gravel with the energy that new beginnings confer, their cheeks flushed and their breath visible in small clouds. Their parents move more slowly, pausing at the water pavilion to rinse their hands and mouths in the ritual purification that precedes every prayer. The shrine building stands before you with its cypress bark roof heavy with frost, and the smoke of the first offering rises straight upward in the windless morning. You feel the cold of the stone basin against your palms as you follow the motions of those before you, the water shockingly chill against your wrists, the wooden dipper returning to its place with a hollow sound. The new year spreads through the city like ink through water, gradual and irreversible, carrying with it the weight of all the resolutions and hopes that attend any threshold. The third month brought the doll festival, Hinamatsuri, and you find yourself in a merchant's house in Kanda, where the daughter of the household has arranged her collection of figures on a stepped platform covered with red felt. The dolls stand in their court costumes of silk and brocade, the emperor and empress at the highest tier, the attendants and musicians descending in ranks of diminishing size. The room smells of the sweet rice wine, shirazek, that has been prepared for the occasion, and of the pickled blossoms that decorate the dishes of Shitamachi, the diamond-shaped rice cakes in layers of pink, white, and green. A low table has been placed before the display, and the mother of the household moves carefully around it, adjusting the position of a miniature lamp or the drape of a tiny robe. Outside, the day has warmed enough to suggest the spring that the calendar claims has already arrived, though the wind still carries the memory of winter from the north. You notice how the light in the room changes as clouds pass, the dolls' painted faces momentarily shadowed, then bright again with a porcelain gleam. The merchant's daughter, perhaps 12 years old, watches the display with an expression between pride and the sorrow that attends any beauty understood to be temporary. The dolls will remain for 3 days, no more, before being returned to their boxes and the dark of the storehouse, where they wait for the next turning of the year. You understand that this display is also a kind of prayer, an offering of care and attention to forces that arrange human life in tiers as formal as the platform itself. The afternoon deepens, and the mother brings sweet sake in small cups, the taste lingering on your tongue with the faint bitterness of rice, fermented only partially, still close to its origin. The daughter begins to put away the dolls in the reverse order of their display, the attendants first, then the court ladies, finally the imperial pair wrapped separately in white paper to preserve their painted faces from the damp of storage. The room seems larger when the platform stands empty, the red felt folded away, the space where ceremony gathered now returned to ordinary use. You smell the resinous smell of pine decorations at New Year only in memory, the kadamatsu long since burned, the New Year no longer new but established in its habits and disappointments. Cherry blossom viewing, hanami, drew crowds to Ueno and Asukeyama, and you are walking through the park at Ueno as the trees reach their brief perfection. The path before you is lined with vendors selling sake and grilled rice cakes, and the blue cloths spread beneath the trees multiply as the afternoon warms, each group claiming its space among the roots. You step over the legs of a clerk who has removed his outer coat and lies with his head on a wooden pillow, his mouth slightly open, a cup of sake balanced on his chest. Around him, his companions continue their conversation about the prospects of a merchant house in Osaka, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of drinking men who have forgotten the offices they will return to tomorrow. The blossoms above you are not quite at their peak, still holding a trace of green at the base of each petal, but the crowds have come regardless, unable to wait for the perfect day that might arrive with rain or wind to strip the branches bare. Sake spilled on dry grass under cherry trees creates small dark patches that smell of fermentation and earth, and a woman laughs as she writes her cup, the liquid spreading into the roots of the tree that offers its shade without judgment. You find a space on a blue cloth offered by strangers and sit with your back against bark that has known 100 such afternoons, the weight of the tree behind you steady as a wall. You are one of the crowd now, anonymous and accepted, your presence requiring no explanation. The light changes as the sun moves westward, the blossoms taking on a color closer to cream than white, the shadows between the branches lengthening across the grass. A poet stands beneath a particularly ancient tree, composing aloud to an audience that grows and disperses according to the quality of each line. His voice carries the cadence of the classical forms, the syllables counted and arranged, and you catch phrases about the brevity of beauty, the necessary fall, the heart that clings despite all wisdom. The first chill of evening after a hot summer day belongs to a season not yet arrived, but you feel something of its structure in the cooling air that moves through the park now, the sun's warmth withdrawing like a tide that will not return until morning. The 5th month featured Boys' Day with carp streamers and iris baths, and you have come to a Shitamachi alley where the wind carries the sound of children shouting above the flapping of cloth. The alley narrows between wooden houses so close that a person could reach from one second-floor window to touch the neighbor's wall. And above this channel of space, the carp streamers hang from bamboo poles, their painted mouths open, their tails streaming in the wind that finds its way between the buildings. Children chase the streamers with their arms raised, their voices breaking into laughter as a gust lifts the smallest carp, the one that represents the youngest son, almost horizontal with the force of its movement. The smell of iris comes from the baths that have been prepared in every house, the leaves floating on water heated to a temperature that will prevent illness through the coming summer. A grandmother sits on a low stool before her doorway, binding iris, leaves into bundles for those who have no garden of their own, her fingers moving with the automatic skill of decades. The alley breathes with the particular life of a festival that belongs to children, that grants them a temporary sovereignty over spaces usually governed by adult hurry. You stand where the alley opens toward a broader street and watch the carp appear to swim against the current of air, their golden scales catching the afternoon light, their black eyes painted with the fixed stare of creatures that know nothing of the paper and bamboo of their making. A boy of perhaps 6 years runs past you, trailing a string that once held a kite, now tangled in the upper branches of a persimmon tree. He does not stop, drawn by the movement of other children toward the end of the alley where a sweet seller has established his cart. The crackling of casella sweet cakes from a festival stall reaches you, the sound of batter poured on a hot iron, the thin cakes folding in the vendor's fingers as he fills them with sweet bean paste. The alley seems to hold its breath between gusts of wind, the carp hanging limp for a moment, then filling again with the breath that animates their paper bodies. You taste the green of the iris in the back of your throat, the association so strong that the smell alone seems sufficient to summon the medicinal bitterness. The Bon festival in the 7th month welcomed ancestral spirits, and the heat of summer has settled over the city like a blanket that cannot be thrown aside. You are walking in the evening toward a cemetery on the slopes of Yanaka, where lanterns have been lit before the gravestones to guide the returning dead. A merchant closes his shop early to visit his family grave before Bon, and you pass him on the path, his formal clothes dark with sweat, his face composed in the expression that ritual requires. The gate of the cemetery stands open, its pillars wrapped with straw rope for the occasion, and beyond it the lights multiply across the slope like a village suddenly grown on the hillside. The air smells of incense and of the ripe sweetness of summer flowers left as offerings, the lilies and the lotus that belong to this season of ghosts and moisture. You find a place to stand among the stones, reading the names that repeat across generations, the same characters appearing in different combinations, the same hopes for prosperity and longevity carved into granite that will outlast the descendants who come to remember. The merchant has reached his family plot, and you watch him light fresh candles to replace those that have burned low, the flames steady in the windless evening, the smoke rising straight toward a sky where the first stars are becoming visible. The city below seems to exhale, its ordinary concerns suspended for 3 days, while the dead walk among the living with the familiarity of family members who have merely been traveling. The sound of a drum reaches you from the temple below, marking the hour of the welcome, and other drums answer from farther up the slope, a network of sound that connects the various neighborhoods in their common observance. The merchant pours water over the gravestone, scrubbing with a brush he has brought wrapped in cloth, the stone darkening with moisture, the carved characters standing out sharp and clear. You feel the weight of humidity that has pressed on the city for weeks, the air so thick that breathing seems a deliberate act, and you notice how the evening brings no relief, the heat stored in every wall and path releasing slowly into the darkness. The merchant sits back on his heels, his prayer finished, his face wet with more than the heat, and you turn away to give him the privacy that grief and gratitude require. The moon-viewing festival of Tsukumi fell in the 8th month, and you are on a veranda overlooking a garden where pampas grass has been arranged in earthenware vases, the silver heads catching the light of a moon not yet visible above the roofline. The garden has been flooded with shallow water to reflect the moon when it rises, and the surface holds the darkness like a mirror turned toward the earth. Around you, a small group sits in silence, the women in pale kimono that seems to absorb what light remains in the western sky, the men in informal coats that speak of an evening among friends rather than the formality of public occasion. A tray passes with small dishes of dumplings shaped like the full moon, their surfaces smooth and white as the celestial body they honor. You feel the difference in the air against your face, the coolness that moves from the northeast, carrying the promise of clearer skies and the eventual austerity of winter. The moon appears above the ridge of the roof, not full but approaching, its light falling on the water of the garden with the slowness of honey poured from a jar. The pampas grass trembles in the breeze that has risen with the darkness, and someone begins a poem, the syllables falling into the waiting silence, the moon waiting as it has always waited for human attention to acknowledge its presence. You understand that this watching is itself the ceremony, the stillness and the attention more important than any offering. The dumplings remain uneaten on their dish, the sake in your cup warming slowly from the heat of your hand. A night bird calls from the garden, and the water ripples with the passage of something seeking insects at the surface. The moon climbs, and its reflection in the garden pool seems to deepen, to become more solid, as if the water were thickening around it, holding it more securely. You sit with the others in the darkness, and the moon moves across the sky with the patience of a thing that has no need of human witness, though it has received it for 10,000 years. The 10th month brought the Shichigo-san celebration for children, and you are in the precinct of the high shrine, where families have gathered in the clear light of an autumn afternoon. The children in their best clothing move among the adults with the solemnity that ceremonial dress imposes, the 3-year-olds in their padded robes like small adults, the 5-year-old boys in their first formal hakama, the 7-year-old girls in the obai tied properly for the first time. A father adjusts the position of his daughter's hair ornament, his fingers clumsy with tenderness, and the girl stands still with the patience of one who has been prepared for this moment. The shrine buildings rise above you in their ancient shapes, the cypress bark and the lacquered columns, the ropes of twisted straw that mark the sacred from the ordinary. Seasonal foods marked each turning, and you smell the roasted chestnuts that a vendor sells near the entrance, the autumn fruit split open to reveal its yellow interior, the smell mixing with the incense from the offering hall. Bamboo shoots in spring, chestnuts in autumn, the calendar of eating that follows the calendar of the earth's turning, each food appearing at its proper moment and disappearing when the moment has passed. A mother buys a paper charm for her son, the priest's calligraphy promising health and long life, and ties it to the boy's sleeve where it will remain until the new year. The shrine breathes with the particular happiness of adults watching young ones cross thresholds they themselves have long since passed. The afternoon light slants across the gravel of the precinct, and the shadows of the ancient trees reach almost to the threshold of the main hall. You watch a grandmother photographing her grandchildren with a seriousness that belies the pleasure in her eyes, the paper of the charm flapping in the breeze that has risen as the sun descends. The children are released at last from their formal postures, and they run across the open space with the energy that has been contained, their laughter rising toward the roof where crows have gathered to watch the disturbance below. The weight of humidity lifting after an autumn typhoon has left the air crystalline, each distant detail sharp as a blade, the mountains visible beyond the city with a clarity that summer's haze denied. The kabuki season opened with Keiomai's performances in the 11th month, and you are in the theater district of Sakaicho, where the banners of the great actors hang before the theaters, their painted faces glaring with the intensity of roles they have not yet performed. The Keiomais, the face showing, brings together the companies of the various theaters in a display of talent that marks the beginning of the winter season, and the crowds press through the narrow streets with an excitement that the cold cannot diminish. You pass under the entrance curtain of the Nakamura-za, its deep red faded to the color of old wine, and find your place on the raised platform where you will sit for the long hours of the performance. The interior smells of years of tobacco and of the oil lamps that light the stage, and of the audience itself, the wool of their winter clothing, the bento boxes they have brought for the interval. The stage before you holds the potential of all the stories that will unfold across this winter, the revenge and the romance, the historical pageant and the domestic comedy. The musicians begin in the room to your left, the shamisen first notes falling into the expectant silence like stones into a well, and the curtain rises on a scene of snow and exile, the actor's face already conveying the suffering that the dialogue will only gradually reveal. The performance continues through the afternoon, and you feel the cold of the theater settling into your shoulders, the heat of the lamps insufficient against the drafts that move through the building's ancient structure. The hours pass, and the light through the small windows high in the wall changes from afternoon gold to the grey of evening, the performance continuing in its own time, indifferent to the world beyond the stage. Fireworks over the Sumida River began in the early 18th century, and you are on the eastern bank as the first rockets rise against a sky still holding the last color of sunset. The crowd around you has spread across the drying mudflats, the river at low tide exposing its brown banks, the smell of tidal mud mixing with the smoke of the fireworks and the food stalls that line the path. The first explosions are simple, single stars of white and green, but the display grows in complexity as the evening deepens, the patterns multiplying, the sound rolling across the water and returning from the western bank with a delay that creates an echo of thunder. In your memory, children chase carp streamers in a Shitamachi alley, and you understand that this too is a festival of summer's ending, the last bright display before the darkness of autumn and winter. The last fireworks of summer reflect in the dark Sumida, and the city turns toward autumn, the display reaching its climax in a barrage of sound and light that seems to stop the breath of the watchers. The final rocket rises slowly, its trail of sparks visible for long seconds before the burst, and then the darkness returns, more complete for the brightness that preceded it. The crowd exhales, a sound like wind through reeds, and begins the movement toward home, the mudflats releasing their hold on wooden clogs with sucking sounds. You remain for a moment, watching the smoke drift across the water, the last embers falling, the river returning to its ordinary darkness, its ordinary sound. The Yoshiwara Pleasure Quarter held its own calendar of festivals and promotions, and you walk through its gate in the early evening of a day in the 9th month, when the houses display their newest courtesans in a procession of parasols and silk. The quarter exists in a time slightly offset from the city around it, its hours regulated by its own customs, its festivals marking not the agricultural year, but the commercial cycle of entertainment and display. You pass through the narrow streets where the lanterns have been lit despite the early hour, the light reflecting in the canals that run between the houses, the sound of shamisen practice coming from an upper window. The women you see are dressed in the formal costumes of their profession, the layers of robe and obi restricting their movement to a glide that speaks of training and confinement. A group of young men, merchants' sons perhaps, passes you in the direction of the great houses, their excitement barely contained, their money heavy in their sashes. Tonight, one of the most famous houses will present its new courtesan to the public, the event marked by special decorations, by sake provided to the waiting crowd, by the elaborate choreography of appearance and withdrawal that constitutes the public life of these women. You do not enter the house, but stand where the street widens to allow the passage of the procession, the crowd pressing around you, the smell of hair oil and incense, and the particular sweetness of the quarter's enclosed air. The parasol appears first, moving above the heads of the crowd like a moon descending, and then the woman herself, her face painted with the white that erases individual feature, her costume weighing perhaps 30 pounds, moving with the careful steps that the costume demands. The crowd murmurs, assessing, comparing, and the young men push forward with the urgency of those who have come to spend what they have saved for this moment. You watch the courtesan pass, her eyes not meeting anyone's, her attention directed inward to the performance of her own presence, and then she is gone, the parasol rising, the crowd dispersing toward the houses where their names are known, or toward the cheaper establishments where less ceremony attends the transaction. Pilgrimage seasons brought waves of travelers to specific shrines, and you are on the Tokaido road in the 4th month, walking among a group bound for the great shrine at Eyes. The Tokaido road has carried you eastward through 17 posting stations, and now the smell of the sea has faded behind the hills, replaced by the denser, greener scent of rice paddies, and the distant smoke of a city larger than any you have seen. You are standing at the edge of Edo in the hour when the western sky still holds a thin band of purple light above the castle keep, though the streets below have already begun their slow surrender to shadow. Around you, the last pilgrims of the day are passing through the great gate, their straw sandals silent on the dust-packed earth, their wooden tokens clinking against the cords at their necks. The shogunate mandated the registration of all citizens with Buddhist temples, and you can see the proof in the small paper amulets tucked into every traveler's pack, the names of distant parish temples written in ink now blurred by sweat and rain. The bronze resonance of a temple bell lingers in humid air somewhere to your left, though you cannot yet see its source. Mosquito smoke from smoldering punk coils at doorways drifts across your path in thin blue ribbons, each one marking the threshold of a shop or residence where evening preparations are underway. A clerk finishes his accounts by the last window light, his hand cramping around the brush that has recorded 12 hours of transactions in a ledger that will be inspected by his master before dawn. You watch him through the open shutter, his shoulders curved over the low desk, the ink stone catching the last reflection from the sky. The bells of Uno's Kaniji mark the hours for much of the city, and you have heard their pattern change 3 times since you entered the outskirts, each stroke carrying farther now as the daytime noise of commerce withdraws into private spaces. Footsteps echo in an empty alley, then silence. The sound comes from somewhere ahead of you, where the street narrows between warehouses of rice and dried fish, and you pause to let the darkness settle into its proper shape before continuing. The river's movement, always audible, now dominant in the quiet, reaches you from the east, a low, continuous murmur that seems to come from the earth itself rather than any single channel of water. The Sumida River was dangerous after dark, with drowning a common fate, and you remember this warning from a ferryman at the last station, his voice matter of fact, his eyes on the current rather than on your face. Evening curfews were enforced by closing the gates of city districts, and already you can see the gatekeepers making their slow rounds, testing the massive wooden barriers that will soon divide one neighborhood from the next until morning. Sensoji in Asakusa was the oldest temple in Edo, founded in the 7th century. and its pagoda rises visible above the rooftops to your right, its 5 stories catching the last light like a lantern that needs no flame. The city quieted gradually, district by district, from west to east, and you are walking against this tide of silence, moving from the already settled western wards toward the eastern quarters where night has not yet completed its conquest. A woman pauses on a bridge to watch the first lanterns reflected in the canal, and you stop beside her without speaking, the two of you sharing the wooden railing as the water below receives its scattered lights. She wears the plain indigo of a merchant's wife, her hair still pinned in the practical style of daytime, though she has added a single tortoiseshell comb that catches the glow from a passing boat. The pleasure quarters lanterns created an artificial perpetual twilight, but here the darkness is still honest, still capable of swallowing the unwary foot or the unfamiliar path. She does not look at you, and you do not look at her, both of you attending to the same small miracle of light on moving water until she gathers her skirts and continues toward the southern bank. Oil lamps and candles were the primary sources of light after dark, and now you see their multiplication across the cityscape, each flame a small defiance against the weight of evening. The Yoshiwara quarter operated under special evening licenses, and somewhere to the northeast, the perpetual twilight is being constructed now, lantern by lantern, screen by screen, the artificial day that would continue until the real day returned. You have no business in that direction, and you turn westward again, following the sound of the river toward the district where your inn has promised a sleeping mat and a basin of cold water. Night watchmen patrolled with wooden clappers and lanterns, and the first of these figures appears at the far end of the street you have entered, his light swinging in a slow arc that probes the shadows between buildings. A night watchman passes, his clapper striking 3 times. All is well. The sound carries clearly in the cooling air, each impact of wood on wood followed by a brief resonant hum that seems to hang between the plaster walls like a question that needs no answer. You step into a doorway to let him pass, the punk coil above your head releasing its bitter smoke into your hair and clothing, and he nods without breaking his stride, his face half visible in the upward cast of his own lantern, his eyes accustomed to reading darkness rather than light. In a back room, a musician tunes her shamisen for the evening's entertainment, and the thin, plucked notes reach you through a gap in the shutters, each string seeking its proper tension in a series of ascending and descending phrases. The instrument's body is made from the skin of a cat. You remember being told, though you have never seen this preparation, only the polished result that seems to glow with its own warmth in lamplight. The musician pauses, adjusts a peg, begins again, and you stand in the street longer than you intended, listening to someone prepare to be heard by others who will never know her name, only the sound she makes for their evening's distraction. The final bell of Kaneji rolls across the darkened rooftops, and the city breathes out. The sound is not a single note, but a long exhalation of bronze, beginning in the struck instant and continuing far beyond what any human breath could sustain, the metal still singing in its wooden frame, while the air carries the vibration outward in circles that expand and weaken, and finally become indistinguishable from the silence they have entered. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though it is not dawn and this is not the harbor, but the bell has made you feel the same expansion of space, the same sense that something vast has announced itself and now withdraws, leaving you in its wake. Samurai were forbidden to draw their swords in response to commoner insults at night, and this prohibition has shaped the evening's etiquette in ways you are only beginning to understand. The men of the 2 swords move through these streets with a visible restraint, their hands kept deliberately away from their weapon hilts, their gazes fixed on middle distance rather than on any face that might offer challenge. You have seen one such figure pause at a crossing, allow a group of drunk apprentices to pass with their insults unacknowledged, their laughter fading as they realized the dignity of the silence they had failed to penetrate. The rule protects both orders, you understand now, the commoners from death and the warriors from the consequences of their own reflexes. Late-night food vendors served soba and grilled skewers to theatre-goers, and the first of these establishments is opening its shutters as you pass, the charcoal smoke joining the punk coils in a thicker atmosphere of controlled burning. A man in a striped coat arranges his low stools in a row that faces the street, each one positioned for the view of passers-by that will constitute the evening's entertainment for his customers. He does not call out to you, and you do not stop, both of you observing the protocol of strangers in a city where most faces are unknown and must be treated with neutral courtesy until proven otherwise. Owls and foxes were heard in the remaining fields at the city's edge, and though you are far from those fields now, the memory of their sounds persists in the city's own night noises, the hooting of a dove in a temple eve mistaken for something wilder, the bark of a dog carrying the same cadence as a vixen's cry. The city has grown across these fields, swallowed them in the long expansion of the Tokugawa centuries, but something of their former character remains in the spaces between buildings, the narrow strips of garden where vegetables still grow within sight of the castle's shadow. You walk through one such gap now, your feet on packed earth that remembers its former crop, your shoulders brushing the drying stalks of late millet planted against a kitchen wall. The cycle of Edo repeated, 108 times between 1700 and 1800, and you are living inside one of those repetitions, one of those numbered evenings that will be indistinguishable from the others in any record that survives. The thought does not disturb you. You have learned to hear the bells as the city hears them, not as interruptions, but as the pulse of a body larger than any individual sleeper or watcher, a body that continues its slow metabolism, regardless of who attends to it. Mosquito smoke from smoldering punk coils at doorways has thickened in the cooler air, each coil burning down at its own rate, each doorway marked by its particular blue column rising toward the stars that are beginning to appear above the lantern haze. The last purple light in the western sky above the castle keep has finally surrendered to the deeper blue of full night, though the castle itself remains visible, its white walls catching the upward throw of the city's illumination. You have walked far enough now that your legs ache in the unfamiliar way of a traveler who has covered distance without the rhythm of a horse's gait or a boat's rocking, and you begin to look for the lantern that will mark your intended inn. Footsteps echo in an empty alley, then silence. This time the sound comes from behind you, and you do not turn, having learned that the city rewards the appearance of purpose, the simulation of belonging, over any display of uncertainty. The footsteps do not resume, or perhaps they have turned into another street, another narrative that does not intersect with yours. A boatman sleeps in his craft, his form visible as a darker shape against the dark, his breathing audible in the silence that surrounds the water's larger voice. You do not wake him. The crossing can wait for morning, for the light that will make the current visible and therefore navigable, and you turn back toward the streets where the lamps are more numerous, where the clappers of the watch have struck again in their slow progression through the sleeping districts. His lamp is the only light in the temple precinct, and you do not enter, respecting the boundary between the day's business and the night's solitude. A dog barks 3 times, is silent. A baby cries, is soothed. The sounds of human distress and its resolution have become part of the night's texture, no more remarkable than the river's continuous murmur or the bell's long decay. You have stopped trying to locate each sound in its source, have allowed them to become the city's own breathing, its own dreaming, in which you are permitted to move as a kind of thought that has not yet found its sleeper. The Yoshiwara quarter operated under special evening licenses, and its light is different in quality, more numerous, more deliberately arranged to suggest that night has been not conquered but recruited, made to serve purposes that daylight would expose too clearly. You do not go there, but you see its glow against the eastern clouds, a false dawn that will persist until the true dawn replaces it. The sound is older than Edo, older than the shogunate, carried across the straits from a continent whose own night cities have followed their own patterns of curfew and release. The musician pauses, begins a melody, pauses again, and you realize that this is not tuning but performance, the evening's work already begun for an audience you cannot see, perhaps a single listener in the same darkness that surrounds you, perhaps only the walls themselves and their patient absorption of sound. You have come full circle in your walking, or the city has arranged itself to bring you back to this figure, this concentration of attention over figures that will be inspected, approved, filed, forgotten. His ledger is part of the larger registration, this attempt to know and therefore to hold the city's multiplying lives in the net of record and requirement. He does not look up as you pass, and you do not stop, both of you maintaining the invisibility that the night grants to those who do not demand recognition. The first fires of morning began while most of the city still slept, and somewhere to the west, in the castle's kitchens, in the bakeries that served the early market, flames were being kindled against the darkness that still held the eastern quarters. You will not see this dawn, will have found your sleeping mat by the time the sky begins its slow brightening. But you feel the approach of that reversal in the quality of the night's deepest hour, the moment when descent becomes preparation for ascent, when the breath that the city exhaled begins to be drawn in again. Night watchmen patrolled with wooden clappers and lanterns, and you see the next one before you hear him, his light turning the corner ahead, his shadow thrown enormous against the wall behind him. A night watchman passes, his clapper striking 3 times. All is well. The sound is closer now, the resonance shorter in the cooler air, and you step into a doorway to let him pass, the same doorway or another, the same punk coil or another, the smoke rising in a similar blue column toward the stars that have shifted in their slow wheel. He does not nod, does not see you, his attention on the street ahead, the next corner, the next interval of darkness that his light must penetrate and his clapper must claim for the order of the watch. The final bell of Kaneji rolls across the darkened rooftops, and the city breathes out. This is not the final bell, you understand, but a bell that seems final in its depth, its long withdrawal into silence that feels like an ending. This must be the hour they have marked, the deepest point of the night, when even the pleasure quarter has begun its slow diminishment, when the last theatre-goers have eaten their soba, their grilled skewers, and turned toward home or toward the temporary homes that the city provides for those who have none. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or they are asleep, or they have not yet been born, or they have finished their work and been forgotten, their names recorded in ledgers that have themselves been lost, burned, drowned in the floods that the Sumida River brought to the low districts in the years of its anger. The cold air moves across your face, and you do not know if this is the air of night or of morning, of Edo or of some other city that has learned to mark its hours with bronze, to register its citizens with temples, to quiet itself gradually from west to east in a pattern that repeats, until repetition itself becomes the meaning, the fact that continues when all other facts have dissolved into the darkness from which they briefly emerged. Mosquito smoke from smoldering punk coils at doorways rises around you, through you, the blue column of your own dissolution into the city's atmosphere, its continuous exhalation of what has been burned, what has been offered up to the night in the form of light and sound, and the small warmth of bodies gathered against the darkness. Footsteps echo in an empty alley, then silence.